For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado rise?
Madam Clerk, I rise to nominate Hakeem Jeffries for Speaker of the House.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Clerk, we've heard a lot today, yesterday, the day before, about the potential history that may be made in this chamber. But it is worth repeating for the American people watching the history that has already been made by the elevation of the dedicated, talented, passionate, and committed public servant and leader from the state of New York, the first African American, the first person of color to lead any political party in the House of Representatives in the history of our country, and that is Hakeem Jeffries. Madam Clerk, it is with great pride that I rise to nominate the gentleman from New York, the man who has been the lead vote getter 10 times and counting, to be the Speaker of the House. Madam Clerk, the last several days have been difficult for the country and for the American people as they have watched what has unfolded in this chamber, as they have seen the dysfunction laid bare on the other side of the aisle. And I suspect that some Americans watching will recall the dysfunction of years past. My colleague on the other side of the aisle talked about history, Woodrow Wilson, Calvin Coolidge, and the like. I'd like to take folks through more recent history, because I can tell you that as a member from the great state of Colorado, this is not their first rodeo as far as dysfunction is concerned. 4 years ago, today, I was sworn in with my colleagues from the class of 2018 during what became the most difficult and the longest government shutdown in the history of our country. Why? Because of the dysfunction and the chaos on the other side of the aisle. The country then did what it has so often done. It looked to House Democrats to govern and to lead, and under the leadership of one of the greatest speakers in the history of the country, Nancy Pelosi, that is exactly what we did. If we want to talk about history, let's talk about recent history. 2 years ago, tomorrow, I stood here with so many of you in this chamber as our democracy was attacked, as our colleagues on the other side of the aisle tried to overturn an election. And the country, yet again, did what it has done before. It looked to House Democrats to lead and to govern. And that is exactly what we did when we certified the election and we safeguarded the transfer of power. So here we find ourselves again in unprecedented times in the early days of the 118th Congress. First time in over 100 years in which the House of Representatives is unable to organize because the House Republican Conference cannot select a speaker. It's a sad day for this institution, but the country will do what it has done before. It will look to House Democrats to govern and to lead, and under the leadership of Hakeem Jeffries, that is exactly what we will do. Now, you have heard from so many over the course of the last 3 days about the wisdom, the leadership, and the talents of this extraordinary leader from Brooklyn. But let me tell you why I believe that he is the person for this moment. Centuries ago, our nation's second president, John Adams, laid bare his fear that members of this body would gain influence by, quote, meanness, not greatness, by noise and not sense, by ignorance and not learning. Hakeem Jeffries' leadership is rooted in greatness and not meanness. It is rooted in learning and not ignorance. His approach is rooted in common sense and not the empty and jaded cynicism and noise that we see so often in our political sphere. He is a leader for our times, which is why I believe he is the leader for this time. The bottom line, my colleagues, is this. It is 6:30 p.m. here in Washington, D.C. The House of Representatives, this sacred institution, needs a leader. It needs a speaker. It needs a leader who will inspire us. A leader who knows that our best days are yet ahead. A leader committed to our communities and our Constitution and our country. And I am here to tell you that leader is Hakeem Jeffries of the great state of New York. And so, Madam Clerk, it gives me great honor as the chairman of the House Democratic Communications and Policy Committee to nominate Hakeem Jeffries for Speaker of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple things. First, I want to say congratulations to the chairman on his ascension to the chairmanship of the committee. I missed the organizing meeting this morning, and so I want to make sure.
We missed you, brother.
Well, I appreciate that. I will be here for all the future meetings. I also want to say thank you to the acting ranking member, my colleague from Texas, Ms. Escobar, for her leadership during, of course, a very difficult time for the country and for her community in El Paso, and we are all grateful for her service to the country, the caucus, and to her community that I have visited and that I look forward to visiting again. To the witnesses, I want to say thank you, Judge, for your testimony and for your service. Of course, Sheriff, thank you for your service and the service of your many deputies and all the law enforcement who are engaged in Herculean efforts in protecting our communities. Mr. Dunn, I want to tell you just that our hearts and our thoughts and our prayers are with you. My wife and I are expecting our second child later this year, a son, and it breaks my heart to hear your story and very much want you to know that I think across both sides of the aisle here, everyone expresses our deepest condolences to you and to your family. Sheriff, I just want to dig in a little bit on your testimony. I reviewed the written testimony that was submitted by all the witnesses, and a lot of you had written testimony, but then also a memo that was appended, essentially an appendice to your testimony.
Correct.
And I reviewed that appendice, and you suggest a lot of proposals, of ideas, of programs that I gather you believe would help us ameliorate, the emergency that's happening on our southern border. In digging through some of these, just for example, you list enhanced funding for regional communication and interoperability with local and law enforcement. I think that's something that all members of Congress would support. Democrats, Republicans, that's a common sense step that we ought to be funding. You list here continued funding and support for the Stone Garden program. And I don't know if you can talk a little bit about what the Stone Garden program is. I'm certainly aware of it. Some of my colleagues might not be. I know my colleagues from Texas are, but if you'd care to talk a little bit about that program, but a DHS program that you would like to see continued support for.
It's one of the only programs, Congressman, where Stone Garden actually brings partnership between CBP and sheriffs and local law enforcement, to include our state law enforcement. It's a program that sheriffs nationally and beyond have supported. It pays our overtime to include EREs, employer-related expenses, to work side by side with Border Patrol. It's a great program.
So here's why I bring that up. The Stone Garden program has been in existence for quite some time.
Yes.
Back during the administration of President Obama, it was at about $50 million, given the fiscal year. Right now, we're funding it at $90 million for the fiscal year 2023 budget that the president has submitted. That's the exact same number that former President Trump, submitted during the course of his presidency. And I guess why I offer that is because to me, these aren't partisan or, proposals that at the end of the day are focused on blaming one side or the other. This is an example of something that President Biden has continued to do to support, and I presume you support that he's continued funding for the Stone. Similarly, you put here one of the items in terms of a proposal that you'd like to implement is to hire more immigration and asylum hearing officers for all POEs, or Port of Entries, I presume, that acronym. And I'm sure you're already aware of this, that on January 5th, so a few weeks ago, the president announced that there would be an increase of officers at the border to help process migrants. And that's in addition to the 25,000 officers. Obviously, we're waiting in terms of the president's budget to get the exact number. But I think that's something you support as well, I presume, in terms of adding more officers.
I do.
And the reason why I'm asking those questions, again, just to kind of land here at the end, is that from my perspective and from my constituents' perspectives in northern Colorado and in western Colorado, they are focused on solutions, trying to solve the problem. And you've outlined a couple of solutions here. And I'd love to be able to have a thoughtful conversation with my colleagues on their side of the aisle about these different prescriptive proposals and get to a place where we can find consensus. But unfortunately, at least as I've gathered from the parts of the hearing that I've heard, it's a lot of heat from some of my colleagues, unfortunately, about blame and sort of characterizing the problem instead of solving the problem. So I'm hoping that we can get to that. And with that, I'd like to yield my remaining time to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Neguse. 2 quick points. The folks that are being processed by CBP who are seeking asylum, I want to remind my colleagues, seeking asylum is legal. So once they've been processed, they are legally in the country. Second thing, Mr. Roy stated that we called his bill unchristian. We did not. We are quoting his colleague from Texas in the Republican conference, Mr. Tony Gonzalez. He is the one who called Mr. Roy's bill unchristian. And then finally, I would like to ask my colleagues not to slander the U.S. Conference of Bishops, Catholic Charities, and the Catholic Church, as one of our Republican colleagues did just moments ago. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized. Mr. Nels.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here. And it is no secret, quite honestly, it's self-evident. We are facing the worst border.
Associate myself with the remarks of all my colleagues here, in particular the gentleman from Kentucky, in going through the impact of the printing of money and the spending of money over the last 5 years that very clearly drove up inflation. I'm always intrigued when I hear my colleagues throw out all of the responses and actions of government and Congress necessary to go clean up the mess of what Congress did previously and what the government did previously. And because that's what's being promulgated here. It's like, oh, we must do something. We must do something about the inflation that government created, right? So what should we do? I don't know, another program that probably spends more money. That would do it. That would douse the flames of inflation created by the great wisdom of the government. That's always seems to be the driving force. It's like, well, gosh, we just created this massive fire, and yeah, let's just throw some more gas on the fire by taking more action. Yet we put forward a bill. It's a simple 3-page bill. Look, don't worry. There's some more bills coming. There'll be some more conversations about spending a little later this year. We have lots of conversations ahead of us about spending. Conversations we should have about spending, about debt ceilings, about why we're continuing to borrow money we don't have to fund a government that's at direct war with the American people on a daily basis, undermining their ability to create opportunity and growth for their families, interfering with their freedoms every single day by bureaucrats in this town. We'll have plenty to say about that and plenty of legislative vehicles in which to go deal with those. Right now, what we're simply asking for is information. How many times, my colleagues, how many times do we reach out to bureaucrats in these agencies asking them to tell us something and they just shrug? I talked to an inspector general from one of the agencies just today, stonewalled over and over and over again in the agency in which this individual operates, unable to get facts, unable to get truth, unable to get answers to the very questions that individual wants to get in the very agency that individual is tasked with overseeing as the inspector general. So here we have a 3-page bill that really shouldn't be all that debated, but we politicize everything. And we've got a 3-page bill to simply say, hey, if the president acts through an executive order, we would like to know whether there's an inflationary impact. Mm-hmm. That's it. That's what we're having this whole debate about. It's actually kind of funny, except that it's really important. Look, when President Trump was president, and he issued an executive order, or I don't even know if it's an executive order or a administrative action, but whatever, to have the emergency at the border declared and say, we're going to fund a wall with military funding. Well, I support a wall being built in Texas because we need to be able to deal with the border. I support a whole lot of other policies to deal with the crisis at the border. But I don't particularly love the use of emergencies to do that sort of thing. But I supported it. It was an emergency, but I think those things should be very short-lived and Congress should act. So I introduced the Article 1 Act with my friend Mike Lee over in the Senate to say, hey, maybe we should review the 40-odd plus emergencies we're still operating under that date back to the 1970s. Maybe all 435 members of Congress should care about Article 1 authority relative to Article 2 authority. Maybe we should actually do something about it. Maybe we should try to make them respond to us. So if we think policy making by executive order is a good thing down here in Article 2 land, I'm just going to disagree with that. I don't think we should allow the president to just unilaterally do stuff and we don't look at it and go, hey, what are you doing? Because, it's actually our job. And so for me, this is just another tool. I'm not a big fan of reports, right? But to get to the truth of trying to understand from the bureaucrats down the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue and scattered all over creation, okay, if there's an executive order, how much is that going to cost? What's that going to do from an inflationary standpoint? That is why I offered amendments not to exempt certain things. I don't like our defense hawks on either side of the aisle to go around saying, oh, but national security. Really? Right? There's no inflationary impact to what we're going to do for spending on national security, as if that should be exempted. Of course it shouldn't be exempted. We should make rational decisions about every dollar we spend. We should actually debate guns and butter. Heaven forbid we have a debate about guns and butter in this town and have, Econ 101 returned to the halls of Congress. But I am, what's that? You are for guns. That's true. We do know that. A couple of, interesting data points. We're talking about, inflation. And I would just ask my friend from Kentucky, Mr. Comer, if he is familiar that, national health expenditures in this country went from about $3 trillion in 2010 to $4.3 trillion currently. Does that sound about right?
Yes.
Does it sound about right that, meanwhile, United Health grew about 172%, Cigna 653%, CVS Health 181% over the decade from 2010 to 2020, and I could go down the list of massive expansion of private healthcare entities. There's a gentleman I think is probably familiar because Humana I think has a footprint in Kentucky that Humana stopped servicing private insurance last week, announced that they were going to stop servicing employer-provided health insurance last week. Why? Because they're going to move their business entirely to government-sponsored health insurance. That's what's going on. You want to know what's driving inflation beyond simply the $5 trillion that was printed? Let's go back to some of the policy choices by this body to massively expand the government's role in a corporate crony state, to expand the government role in healthcare, driving up the price of healthcare in the name of coverage. Which, by the way, still praying for my friend from Maryland. My cancer, when I went to MD Anderson, and I had insurance then that I was allowed to go to MD Anderson in 2011, under the Obamacare plan that I would get as a member of Congress, because despite the fact everybody says we're on some sort of, gold-plated plans exempt from, what the American people have, we're on an Obamacare plan. I couldn't get on MD Anderson. That's how great our coverage is. But you know what? I might be able to do something about that as a member of Congress. Really rich people certainly can do something about it. But the average person shoved into an Obamacare plan is screwed, unable to go to MD Anderson for the most part. So look, what I'm saying is we've created government action, driven up the price of goods and services in healthcare. We've got government action driving up the price of energy on a regular basis. My friend from Maryland talked about climate change. Well, this is actually part of the problem. We act like we've got like a magic energy tree, right? Oh, we'll just go plug in our hybrids all over America, but where's the energy come from? It comes from somewhere. And so we go around saying, oh, let's pat ourselves on the back because we're constraining the ability of us to produce actual energy in the form of nuclear, gas, clean burning American gas, coal even. While China has 1,100 coal-fired plants, we have about 250. They're building one a week. We're building none. We pat ourselves on the back that we're doing something for CO2 production. Meanwhile, China and India are just blowing the lid off the top. And so we're sitting around going, oh, look at us. Look how great we are, making electricity prices higher, making grids more unreliable. And people wonder why there's inflation. Of course there's inflation when you're constraining the ability of the market to go produce energy. Yeah, no, it's totally true. And the fact is, I'd yield to John.
Wait, gentlemen, the sidebar here was that I understand the policy disagreements about the various federal laws that we enacted over the last year. I guess what I'm trying to get at is the press release from Ms. Stefanik, the committee sheet from the rules staff here, the only executive order that is referenced is Keystone Pipeline. And of course, the majority is welcome to put a bill on the floor with respect to that particular issue. Is there another executive order in mind that you all are, that you claim had an inflationary impact, and so this bill is targeting? Because I guess I haven't.
And I'll take the climax. There are all sorts of, and look, I'll tell you what. I'll go.
Can you name one?
First of all, I'll research and come up with a list for you because I guarantee you there's a list. But let me tell you some examples.
Well, I mean,
but let me see examples.
That's what we're debating.
No, I'll tell you right now some examples.
Maybe Mr. Comer has one.
So we have the cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline. We have the efforts by the executive branch in terms of the moratorium on federal oil and gas leases and pause on leasing in ANWR, the overturn of the Trump executive action related to WOTUS and NEPA, the rejoin the disastrous Paris Climate Agreement, executive orders that directed the EPA, SEC, Interior, Energy to engage in rulemakings that restrict growth and drive up inflation. There's all sorts of ESG orders in the middle of the Labor Department, and those ESG orders are driving, through ERISA plans, are driving the crap up in the price of goods and services because they're more expensive. And those fees, by the way, are more expensive. What's that?
Clarifying, those are rules. I think we're taking up a bill in a moment regarding the rules that were promulgated by DOL. I don't think that would apply to this
My point is
bill.
that these actions, these rules, these executive orders by the executive branch ought to be looked at in full. And look, tell you what, if we want to offer an amendment that expands the zone to more administrative and executive action, I'm happy to do it, right? I want to know the damage being done by an executive branch that we're not overseeing. And so, look, if we want to expand that to understand the inflationary impact, I'd be happy to do that.
The gentleman,
make it bigger.
Yeah, I mean, just on that point, I mean, this is part of what I'm driving at is intellectually, I understand the argument you might make about an agency that promulgates a rule, and of course there are requirements within rulemaking for cost analysis and so forth. But that's the point that I'm making is that's very divorced from the executive orders that are being issued by the president. It doesn't seem like beyond again, I understand your objection with respect to Keystone Pipeline. Sure. Beyond that, I'm not hearing much in terms of executive orders being offered by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that would be subject to this bill in terms of an inflationary impact. But again, won't belabor the point.
Well, my colleague here has a list and be happy to go through them. There are an enormous number of actions by the executive branch on a regular basis. There are executive orders that have inflationary impacts. That is, I think, on both sides of the aisle. And look, and by the way, I have zero partisan, decision making here from my end here in terms of believing that it should apply to one versus another. Again, that's why it's a little out of sync with this. But the Article 1 Act directed President Trump to limit those executive orders was on that basis, very specifically to do that. And in this case, we're simply just saying we'd like to know the inflationary impact.
Would the gentleman?
I would yield to the gentleman from Kentucky.
I just have a quick question for Mr. Comer or for Mr. Roy. I don't see Joe Biden's name mentioned in this bill. This would apply. We're going to have a presidential election, right? And if a Republican wins that election, a Republican who makes executive orders would have to comply with this bill as
Yes,
well.
sir.
Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Applies to both parties, whoever the President of the United States is.
So there doesn't seem to be any partisanship in this bill. So I'll yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
Yeah, and just to be clear, the list that I rattled off there, all of those were initiated at one point through executive orders. Now, you can go back and kind of peel that onion back to say whether it's directly impacting or not. I'd certainly prefer it to be able to apply more broadly, to know whatever executive actions and rulemakings are being done. But there were executive orders that triggered most of those things that I just rattled off. That's my point. How it would directly apply, happy to debate, but that's the purpose. Those executive orders had direct impact on inflation.
Will the gentleman yield?
Sure.
Briefly. Would just say the CBO analysis that we received, maybe a different CBO analysis that Mr. Comer received, suggested that there will be about one executive order a year that would be subject to this bill. So, again, I'm not, so if you want to pursue amendments that would make this bill meaningful and substantive, I hear you. But I'm just, again, that's what the CBO gave to us.
Yeah,
Maybe I'm,
well, first of all, I could talk about the CBO for a while if you'd like, but we'll leave that aside. But I would also note that there are significant studies, for example, that would make very clear about the overall costs on these things, like the Committee for, the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget estimated Biden's executive actions cost a total of $1.1 trillion, 23% of spending under his administration. My point is just simply, this is a serious problem. And look, if my colleagues on the other side of the aisle think that it has very little impact and would produce a report on one executive order a year, okay, I'm not sure what the fuss is over. You should say, well, gosh, maybe we should just kind of sit back and let this roll. But my point is, this thing is actually about a much bigger problem, and I do believe the CBO is wrong. It will touch more.
What would the gentleman yield? I think Mr. Neguse may have been expressing support for your amendment, which lowers the threshold for this report to be created. Right now, there's $1 billion threshold, and you eliminate that or lower it to $100 million? Or?
Yeah, there's another amendment that would lower the threshold and expand it so there's no exemptions for national
would gentleman yield?
It's not my time, it's Mr. Roy's, but I just found, before I give it back to Mr. Roy, I just find it interesting that you were concerned, it seemed, that there wouldn't be enough reports. But it seems as if Mr. Roy has the remedy for that. Now yield back to Mr. Roy.
Sure.
I yield to the gentleman.
Yeah, and I would just simply say I appreciate the invitation by Mr. Massey. I look forward to reviewing the language. My concern was how we're spending our time. We're spending our time discussing this bill as opposed to other more substantive bills. But I guess my concern would be to the extent you lower the limit, I don't know if that's going to drive up the cost of doing these analyses. So we're talking a lot about government spending, but this bill's going to have a price tag as well. The more that you lower the limit in terms of the executive order.
Reclaiming my time, which is it? You want to be more effective or less effective? I deal with the chairman.
Just quickly, I'm concerned about time as well. Yeah. So I just remind you that we will be here for a long time. Yeah. We have votes going. The gentlemen are free to have as much discussion back and forth as they care to, but understand there'll be a consequence afterwards. So yield back to my friend from Texas.
Taking my time back, I appreciate that from the chairman. I've given that speech to my kids a lot, which maybe says something here. But look,
gentlemen, I live all by myself and I go home alone, so I'm happy to be here all night and be entertained. And it's a great dialogue. Seriously, I mean that quite seriously.
Well, no, I appreciate that. And my family and my kids are in Texas, so when I'm here, it's just fair game. I can be here late too, but. Look, for our colleagues, I will yield back here, but I do think it's important here to understand the purpose of the bill. Again, we're talking about time and, we're wasting time. Well, then just voice vote it. I mean, look, at the end of the day, this is just simply a point that we're trying to make very clear to the American people about the significant amount of spending that goes on by the executive branch that has an inflationary impact. And I think the American people do know that, and also to make sure the American people understand that our response to every problem created by government isn't actually to put gas on that fire, but to figure out how we can constrain the actual problems caused by government action, which is, in fact, what the American people want us to do, to free them up to be able to solve these problems rather than have government solve these problems. I yield back.
Gentlelady from Indiana is recognized for questions.
Gentlewoman from Indiana reserves. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Speaker. I yield 2.5 minutes to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Neguse.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentlewoman, my colleague from Pennsylvania. Like many of my colleagues here in this chamber, I am blessed to be a parent. My wife and I are proud parents of a 4-year-old daughter, and we are deeply invested in her education and ensuring that she has the ability to be able to live her dreams. And so you can imagine my surprise and my disappointment when I learned that the Republicans, our colleagues on the side of the aisle, would be spending our time today on this bill, the Politics Over Parents Act. Surprise because for so many years, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have bemoaned the role of the federal government in public education. They have lectured us about local control time and time again. And yet here they stand with a bill to impose a variety of unfunded mandates on school districts across the country and eroding local control, as my colleague from Ohio, Mr. Landsman, articulated. And disappointment because these unfunded mandates are so disconnected from the real concerns and fears that parents in my district, back home in Colorado, are experiencing every day. Just yesterday, the Denver metro area in Colorado was frozen with fear at the news of another incident of gun violence in one of our schools, East High School. 2 teachers were wounded, one of them critically. This came on the heels just 2 weeks ago of the tragic death of a 16-year-old student at East High as a result of gun violence. Our prayers, our thoughts, our hearts go out to him, his family, his friends, all the students and the parents who have been impacted in just the last 14 days as yet another incident of gun violence tears our community apart. That's what parents in Colorado are concerned about. They're concerned about their students, their children coming home from school alive. They're concerned about the ability of children to be able to get a quality education and not go hungry, to not be poisoned by lead pipes in some of the dilapidated buildings in rural and urban communities across our country, about the cost of childcare. Mr. Speaker, that's what they're concerned about.
Time has expired.
I'd ask the gentlelady for an additional 30 seconds.
Yes.
The gentleman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
I thank the Speaker. That is what parents, families are concerned about back in Colorado. And so I would urge my colleagues to oppose this rule so that we can get on to the business of addressing those concerns that I've articulated on behalf of parents and families across our great country. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman
From Colorado, a distinguished member of the Rules Committee, Mr. Neguse.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the distinguished ranking member. I didn't prepare a speech today. I brought the bill to the floor because I have great empathy for my colleague on the other side of the aisle who has the unenviable task of somehow trying to defend this 200-page bill, the Polluters Over People Act. 200 pages that puts polluters first at every turn. And if you don't believe me, I encourage you to read the bill, Mr. Speaker. Buried in this 200-page bill on page 40 is a provision that gives the Secretary of Energy and the Administrator of the EPA the power to grant a waiver to any refinery in this country from the key requirements of bedrock environmental laws that have governed this space for the better part of the last 50 years since the days of President Richard Nixon. Look at subparagraph C that enables any party who acts under a waiver granted under this bill to violate any environmental law and have blanket immunity. The Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, NEPA, you name it, they'll waive it. That is not a bill that puts people first. It's a bill that puts polluters first, and it's why I'm proud to vote no, and why I encourage every member of this distinguished body to vote no against this bill. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Colorado is recognized for questions.
The New York Post. What a citation.
Thank you. Thank you.
The dregs.
There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
thank you to each of the witnesses. Grateful for all of you being here today, and certainly appreciate your testimony on such an important topic. There's a lot to unpack. I want to start with the conversation that my friend from Pennsylvania was engaged in with our colleagues from the Appropriations Committee regarding veterans' health care. As I read the bill, and I'm grateful to our former chair, Ranking Member DeLauro, for stating with simplicity the specific provision of this bill that I think is at issue. As I read the bill, I don't think there is any ambiguity that it provides no protection whatsoever for veterans' funding from the drastic cuts and the caps in this bill. Specifically, it takes back $2 billion in funding previously provided to the Department of Veterans Affairs to support veterans' medical care. Am I reading this provision wrong, Madam Ranking Member?
That's absolutely the case.
Mr. Chairman-designate, Representative Fleischman, I want to make sure I give you the opportunity. I guess where is the discrepancy here?
It's my understanding, once again, that we have unequivocally stated in the record that we are not going to touch veterans' care, defense, or homeland in this bill. I think the gentleman in reading this may be comparing some pre-existing COVID funds.
Correct.
In effect, what would be viewed as one person's cut would be another person's non-cut. So I think it's a matter of semantics, but we would maintain.
What does that mean? What do you mean?
It means that veterans' care will be fully protected in this bill, as has been unequivocally stated.
Your bill calls for the rescission of unobligated funds in the amount of $2 billion that have been allocated to the Department of Veterans Affairs. That's in the bill. So I don't understand this representation you're making that somehow your statements here today
Certainly.
override the text of the bill.
I would be glad to address that, and I would look to my colleagues to supplement my comments. If we do things in regular order, like we should through the appropriations process, through the 12 appropriation bills, including the Veterans Bill, which we have unequivocally stated on the record will not be cut or touched, in addition to defense or homeland security. What I think the gentleman is referring to is pre-existing COVID funds that were in another bill, not done in order in the appropriations process, so that those funds, in effect, would be not apples to apples. This would be, you'd be talking, if you will, apples to oranges. Our position is going through this, these funds, as we appropriate to a fiscal 24 level, will not be cut. Veterans care in regular order will be left and will be left protected.
Ms. DeLauro?
I find this just unbelievable. You have a bill, you have pieces in the bill, sections in the bill. You want to tie this bill to a debt ceiling holding our economy hostage and passing this piece of it in tandem. And a part of it says, it's there in black and white. It says that you will rescind immediately, the word immediately is there, $2 billion for veterans' health care. You also have talking about, within your bill, going back to 2022 budget numbers. If you go back to 2022 budget numbers, we are looking at cutting veterans' health care by 22% or more if you decide you're holding defense harmless. And that includes, as I mentioned before, you've got there housing support for veterans, job training, people who suffer from homelessness, mental health issues that veterans have. All this is going to be cut. Then you have people talking about cutting underfunding the VA's request of $20 billion for the PACT bill, which was a bipartisan piece of legislation. You know what is the sentiment? You can put lipstick on a pig, but it's, and call it Monique, but it is still a pig. This bill is very explicit as to what the cuts are going to be doing. Now, you can't speak out of both sides of your mouth when you're talking about these bills. Reconsider. That's all I'm suggesting is reconsider where you want to go. Don't tie this to the debt ceiling. Think about what you want to cut or not cut when it comes to the appropriations bills. You all have elided the two, and you can't get away from that.
Let me just say, I'll give you a moment, I'll give you in a minute. Because I empathize with the ranking member's frustration here. And here's why. I think we can have a debate, and of course the committee's been engaged in a debate, on underlying merits of the proposal that you put forward. Discussion about the various tax credits, Mr. Reschenthaler engaged, Mr. Harrington, Mr. Beyer, on the propriety of those credits. We have a position with respect to those. You have a different position. Let's have that debate. I understand your argument about the regular order consideration of appropriation bills and your argument as to how you make the case in your view that the bill doesn't provide for cuts to certain programs that we contend exist. I don't agree with your argument, but I understand your argument. But I want to give you another opportunity to at least concede the plain language of this bill as it relates to the unobligated COVID funds clearly states that it provides for a rescission of $2 billion from the Department of Veterans Affairs. If this bill passes tomorrow in the House and passes the Senate and is signed by the President of the United States, the Veterans Affairs Department is immediately deprived of $2 billion of funds that were previously appropriated under the law. It's not, this isn't a gotcha. I'm just, if you can, give an honest answer. I mean, and you can make the case. You can say, that's our position. We don't think the Department of Veterans Affairs should have that particular allocation. But let's have an honest debate about the issue. I'm happy to yield to my colleague here, if maybe you can clarify this.
Well, first of all, either the federal government, the state government, or the local government has failed the veteran. If there were $2 billion that should have gone in service to our veterans for some purpose that hasn't been articulated, but I believe what you're saying. 2 years. 2 years, $50 billion or more for various and sundry things. We said we're not cutting the recurring support for veterans in discretionary. We're not cutting recurring, if I may.
I know, of course.
Recurring funding on the mandatory side. And then you've got $50 to $60 billion that has been sitting out there for 2 years. Either it's not necessary anymore for whatever purposes that would accompany those monies, or some government entity at some level failed. And so I think it's a great conversation, and I would say come to the negotiating table, because maybe we can make this a better set of provisions if we can negotiate.
But I want to drill down on this, because again, you're making an argument about the propriety of the rationale for the decision you've made in the bill, and I understand your argument. But so you at least concede the bill does do what I'm saying, right? You're not denying it.
Reason to believe that you're not telling the truth.
I mean, I'm reading the bill. The bill you all wrote. I mean, again, I'm not. This isn't a gotcha question. I just want one person to concede that the bill says that unobligated COVID funds are being withdrawn. You all are. You're advertising it. It's one of the reasons that you're pursuing this bill. I don't understand why folks are denying it.
May I address the clarification?
Sure.
I think there's just a little misunderstanding in language. The COVID funds, right? This is money were spent for COVID. It's PPE, masks, air filtration systems, whatever. The Veterans Administration, 4 months ago, maybe even 6 months ago, withdraw any of the obligations, any of the commitments that had to be said for these type of things. So basically, we're not spending the money that doesn't need to be spent because we're out of the pandemic. This money was allotted to the Veterans Administration for spending during the pandemic for COVID issues. And the fact now that the VA gets a budget, in fact, in Veterans Affairs, where I was a few months ago, the the director of the Veterans Affairs came forward and proposed his new budget. So the $2 billion, one, has not been spent on anything COVID-related and doesn't need to be spent on anything COVID-related.
And so, again, I'll try to ask this question one more time, because I think you're conceding it, but I don't.
No, it's money that's not needed, and so it doesn't need to be spent on COVID.
And so your position, you concede the bill contemplates rescinding the $2 billion that the VA could spend under existing law,
Well,
that it no
was
longer.
intended
I understand the
for
argument.
COVID
Hold on.
and doesn't need to be spent on COVID.
I understand the argument you're making. The point is, Mr. Fleischman, a few moments ago, earlier, when I posed this very same question, denied that this bill deprives the Department of Veterans Affairs of any money, including with respect to the unobligated COVID funds.
Well, this is
That's
not
all
in
I'm
the regular.
getting
Yes,
at.
sir, I
So
understand.
that's what I'm saying.
Absolutely.
So, and at least, so now let's talk about.
This is
I'm gonna-
extra money that was being
Okay.
sent to the VA
So
for
let's-
the purpose of COVID.
I'm
COVID's over, so
I'm-
we're taking it
I'm
back.
going to give my colleague, the ranking member, an opportunity here, because now that we have all agreed to the same set of facts, I think that can be stipulated for folks who are watching, that this bill would deprive the Department of Veterans Affairs of $2 billion that the United States Congress appropriated to it on a bipartisan basis. That's what this bill does. Ranking Member DeLauro, perhaps you can explain what that $2 billion would be spent on if House Republicans were not working to deprive the agency of that funding.
Remember, DeLauro, just for the record, Mr. Chairman Smith has now returned, reclaimed his chair, and our colleague from North Carolina, Mr. Murphy, is no longer on the panel.
Okay. Let me answer this question if I can here. This money is $2 billion. It is veterans' medical care. That would underfund the VA by $2 million for the remainder of the year. $1 billion because of the rescission. Now, let me just tell you that it is, clawing back this funding would curtail the improvements that the VA has made on whittling down the backlog of veterans' claims and appeals that grew out of the pandemic. That means that without the ability to use these funds, and the funds not being there, it's longer waits for claims and appeals. It continues to put veterans' health care in jeopardy. There is a reality there about this, and it is immediate, and it is for the remainder of the year, because it is totally about veterans' medical care. You can try to whitewash it in any way that you like. If I could just say one other thing, Mr. Congressman Neguse, in terms of, now that's one piece. That's in the COVID stuff. You want to deal with a 22% cut overall with the discretionary spending for veterans. What does that mean? Okay? Cutting staff and longer wait times for benefits here would require reduction in force of 1,178 staff, limits the ability to fully fund annual pay increases for existing employees. It would delay improvements to the compensation and pension fund. The Board of Veterans Appeals would face up to a $57 million shortfall. That's about 25,000 fewer decisions, reduction of 300 staff in FY 2024. It set back the support for telehealth, which was so critical to veterans during the pandemic. $345 million shortfall there. You know, national cemeteries, $36 million. That's for the upkeep of the veterans' cemeteries, and it would cut back the funding, $565 million shortfall for deteriorating VA infrastructure. Now, if you want to try to finesse the $2 billion, But the 22, going back to 2022, and the over 22% cut deals with all this as well. How do you get out of that box in terms of trying to explain away what you are doing with regard to veterans' health care with this bill? Thank you very much.
No, I agree with the ranking member. In full disclosure, I started with that with Title I, with Section 201, because I thought it would be an easier place for us to at least concede to a common set of facts, because I understand, again, I disagree with it, but I understand the argument that folks on your side of the aisle are making about irregular order consideration of the appropriation bills. I disagree with it. I think, for all the reasons that the ranking member stated, it's very clear that if this bill were to ultimately become law, that veterans would face pronounced cuts. Pronounced cuts. But at a minimum, I thought that we could at least concede again to that, or rather not concede, agree to that same common set of facts with respect to the $2 billion withdrawal, the $2 billion rescission, because it's so clearly stated in the text of the law. And I think we now are at least in agreement that the Republican bill does what it says it does. It ultimately would rescind $2 billion from the Department of Veterans Affairs. And look, that's ultimately, your prerogative. That's the choice that you put forward to this Congress, to the People's House, and to America's representatives, right, is to either give in to the demands that you have set out, to say nothing of all of the draconian cuts that, we could spend all evening tonight talking about the 22% cut to Meals on Wheels, the cuts to American seniors, families that are struggling to make ends meet. The list goes on and on. Either we give in to those demands, or alternatively, we're told you will default on America's debt, and unemployment will double, stock market crashes, prices go up, costs go up for everyone on everything. And that is a Hobson's choice that I do not think the American people should be compelled to make. And it boggles my mind that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have put us in this precarious position in the first place, particularly when so many of you voted to increase the debt ceiling without any conditions under the prior administration. Not all of you, and I know there are colleagues on the other side of the aisle who have voted against the debt ceiling in the past. So I'm not, I'm talking to the folks in the room who know, who were here when President Trump was in office and when this body voted to increase the debt ceiling without conditions. Let's talk about tax credits. So I appreciated the thoughtful debate between Mr. Beyer, Mr. Harrington regarding some of the tax credit provisions of this bill. I wonder, Mr. Beyer, you're very knowledgeable about these provisions. I'll ask for unanimous consent, a request to enter a Department of Energy letter into the record. It's a letter from the Department of Energy which states that the reductions of this magnitude, these are with respect to the tax credits that Mr. Reschenthaler was asking about, would have significant setbacks on U.S. competitiveness to adversarial nations like Russia and China, including by eliminating funding for over 5,000 scientists, students, and technical staff at our national laboratories and universities. Perhaps the chair might be willing to consider that unanimous consent.
Objection.
I thank the chairman. Mr. Beyer, talk a bit to me about the biofuel credits, because I was surprised that this bill included a repeal of a variety of different credits as it relates to biofuels, some of which have existed in the law prior to the Inflation Reduction Act. And I can't for the life of me, I represent Colorado. We've got a thriving solar industry, thriving wind industry. I understand that the Midwestern United States, home to a thriving biofuel industry. And it makes no sense to me how someone could argue, who represents that part of the country, that these provisions should be eliminated from the law. I just don't get that. But maybe you can expound on it for me.
Congressman Neguse, thank you for the question. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me either. They don't actually grow any corn in Northern Virginia, so I'm not deeply invested in it. But I do know that very red states, Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa and others, grow an awful lot of corn and have fought very hard for the biofuel provisions. I know there's been a lot of debate in the environmental community about whether the biofuels are a net gain for the environment. And I don't have a scientific opinion on that. But I do think it seems to be one of the many arrows in our quiver to try to make our vehicle fleet ever more greenhouse gas resistant and also more independent. Moves us in the direction of energy independence. We don't have to import corn, although I think we actually do some from Brazil. But I think this is a credit that made sense at the time, and it's surprising that they would want to repeal it.
Well, I'd be happy to yield any of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle for a colloquy. For those, I don't know if they grow a lot of corn in Pennsylvania, and I know our colleague from Minnesota isn't here, but maybe when she returns, because I just would love to get a better sense from the folks who come from that part of the country, how they could justify supporting a bill that repeals those provisions. It's obviously every member entitled to their own views and reaching their own conclusions as to the propriety of the provisions of this bill, but it just, to me, doesn't really comport with, I would think, our goals as a country and certainly the goals for those regions. Mr. Reschenthaler seems like he's tempted to weigh in, but I'll let, if he'd like.
Right, we have a lot of abundant, clean natural gas in this country, too. We also have options for nuclear energy. We don't have to necessarily use our food source for our fuel source because we're so blessed with all the natural resources we have. Just the counter argument there, but I'll yield back. Thanks for the colloquy.
The last thing I will say is, we'll return the call. I'd love to engage with, as I said, someone who comes from a region that's home to the industry that ultimately is going to benefit from, or rather will be greatly damaged by the virtue of repealing of these provisions. The last thing I guess I would say is this. It doesn't have to be this way. I don't think anybody in this room, I suppose maybe I could be wrong. Maybe there's some of you who ardently believe in the bill that you've put forward. Perhaps there are a few, but I'm not sure that's the case. I think that there are far more prudent ways to approach our nation's fiscal health than putting forward a bill that defaults on every promise we've made to America's seniors, to America's veterans, to America's families. It just doesn't make sense to me that this would be the approach that my colleagues on the other side would take, but I'm sure we'll continue to debate this through the night and expound. Well, sure, I'll go to Mr. Byer, and then I'll give you an opportunity, Mr. Harrington, to respond.
Congressman Neguse, before you give up the floor, I just wanted, if it was appropriate, to make a few comments about Mr. Reschenthaler's thoughts on the IRS.
Sure. I'll concede. Someone was in my ear, so I missed the first part of his statement.
Okay, well, just with respect, first of all, thank you for all those numbers. I think I want to write a letter tonight at the IRS chief about how many agents actually carry. It'd be interesting to see the difference between those that are packing heat every day and the arsenal that you've described. The second question I have for him is why that arsenal? Because that doesn't make a lot of sense. Because the last thing any of us want are pistol-packing IRS agents beating down people's doors. Also, on the 87,000, we prefer to call them staff rather than agents because most of them, will not be knocking on the doors of businesses. And I thought there were 734 billionaires. Thank you for getting that number right one more. Rather, the 87,000 is intended to pick up for the 10-year retirements and the replacement of staff. As we know, I don't know what the exact number is today, but some whopping percentage of our federal workforce is within 10 years of retirement. And we have to plan for that, and that's what the money does. And you see in the enforcement that 45 billion, so a little more than half of it is for enforcement. And a huge part of it, 25 billion, is just for operations, to rebuild the systems that are running on COBOL, where the people that understand how to code in COBOL are rapidly dying in this country, and they're teaching it nowhere. That enforcement is our best attempt to look at the tax gap, which at the low end is 500 billion, at the high end is $1 trillion or more. That is not the 1099s and the W-2s that all of us do, where 99% pay their taxes on time, but all the unreported income, as taxes are due, without having to raise anybody's taxes, just collect the taxes that are already due in our democracy. And if you know a better way to get it, I don't know. Maybe we only need 25,000. Well, I agree with that. I
I'm going to reclaim my time here. But
agree with that, too. Yes, and I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Harrington,
Well, I
that?
appreciate my colleague.
one Republican at a time.
Look, I heard a lot of stakeholders in our great country who you said we have a promise to keep. But you didn't mention our children. You didn't mention our children. And quite frankly, it's not just you, I'm not picking on you. Nobody has mentioned our children. That is, look, $6 trillion has been added to the national debt in 2 years by this administration, and mainly my Democrat colleagues, although some of it was bipartisan. But the preponderance of the $6 trillion came from Democrat vast expansion of the government in some form or another, whether it was government-run healthcare subsidies, Obama subsidies, or it was climate-related. But, and listen, this isn't a uniquely Democrat problem, but over the last 2 years, we have never in the history of this country seen that amount of deficit spending ever. And on top of that, the president comes in with the budget, and he's going to spend 25% of our entire economy every year for 10 years, and we haven't spent that kind of money since we invaded Normandy. Now, here's what's wrong with this problem. Nobody's paying for this stuff. It's a deferred tax on our children, and they're not here to talk. They're not here to vote. Can't call on any of them. So we have to say, is it really that courageous to promise all these people all these things when we're really not going to be the ones? Maybe you and I will. Maybe we'll be stuck with some of the bill, but I don't know if you have children or not. I like you a lot. You know that. I have 3. They're going to inherit the whirlwind of our reckless and irresponsible budgeting and fiscal management. I'm okay with taking things to the American people and saying, do you want this climate package? Do you want these taxes? Do you want this government-run health care? Do you want these things? And we can go through the litany of them. But you got to put a price tag with it. And you either got to cut or you got to raise the revenue to do it. But we take the path of least resistance. And that's my biggest, what troubles me the most profoundly, is that, and it's not a uniquely Democrat problem, like I said, but we've seen a record accomplishment of deficit spending where there was no offset. There was no revenue. There was no cut. We just will wait and let our children take that on. I think that's, I've heard immorals mentioned. That's about as close to, that's weak. That is weak leadership, is what I would say.
Let me say this, Mr. Harrington, because I consider you to be a friend. And I think you are intellectually honest, certainly in all of our interactions. But you mentioned children. Let's talk about children. I have a 4-year-old daughter. My wife and I are expecting our second child in a month. Very exciting. Congratulations. What I'm thinking about tonight are the millions of children who will be faced with despair that you and I can't contemplate if this bill becomes law. 3,500 preschool and child care slots in Colorado, gone if this bill becomes law. I know you've been to Head Start programs in your district. I've certainly been to Head Start programs in mine. 2,400 children in Colorado in Head Start, out if this bill becomes law. Food assistance. 19,000 women, infants, and children would lose WIC benefits. 19,000. So those are children. Children in my state, children in Texas, children across the country who don't have enough to eat. These are kids, same age as my daughter, who go to bed hungry, who won't have the ability to access WIC benefits. Why? Because the Republican budget plan proposes cutting it. I just, I hear what you're saying about deficit spending. The president, I know you disagree with him, he's put forward a plan that would reduce the deficit over 10 years by $3 trillion. that doesn't result in the kind of harm to America's children that I just described. To me, that seems like a place that we ought to be able to find some common ground. So,
May I respond to that? Just-
you know, I got to give Rosa, because then, you know, I already owe
I never
her
get in trouble with
an
her.
opportunity, and then, you know, she's my ranking member here, ranking member DeLauro, and then
Thank you,
back to
thank
you.
you. And I appreciate what you've said, except that I don't hear, I've not heard the depth of feeling. And it may be that I can't remember a caller, you're here, but I was here when it was $2 trillion in a tax cut to the richest 1/10 of 1% of the people in this country, and the biggest corporations. And when we were talking about revenue, you talked about the millionaires or the billionaires. We have corporations today, because of the complexity, and they have all the lawyers in the world, they pay zero in taxes. We need to do that. We funded the Iraq War, did it? No, there was no outcry about adding to the debt. It was okay. That is, you know, let's talk about it for what it is. You can't only have this dark night of the soul about the deficit when it is a Democratic administration. Then further, with regard to children, I honestly, and I said this once to the Secretary of Education at the time, was Betsy DeVos, that the cuts that are being made to education would not harm my grandchildren, my kids, not anyone else here, but as Mr. Neguse pointed out, the millions of kids out there that will suffer. We are talking about, it is 300,000 kids with Head Start or with child care. I read the numbers before. In Oklahoma, 3,300 children lose access to Head Start. 1,700 lose access to child care. We're looking at a kid, you know, rental assistance. That doesn't sound like kids. But if you can't find a place to live and you have kids, it affects your kids deeply. We do not seem to be that concerned about what is going to happen to the millions of kids in this country that are not either our kids or grandkids, who are well taken care of, and they will continue to be. And we will not deign to look at as a revenue source, raising revenues on those people, as Mr. Byer pointed out. Let's just collect what they owe. We're not adding anything to it, but they certainly owe us, in some instances, as has been said, over $1 trillion. That would help us do what we need to do. Thank you, Mr. Neguse.
I have what I've referred to as a parade of progressive Democrat earmarks. I could run through them, and I could ask you, what's more important, Head Start or the LGBTQ Museum in New York City? What's more important, Head Start or the B360, a group that promotes dirt bike culture in Baltimore? What's more important, Head Start or the Michelle Obama Trail, with all due respect to the First Lady? Like, we're acting like we're spending other people's money here, not just taxpayers, but our children. And we're not making any trade-offs. This is total fantasy. So what you can do is
But you're not cutting the trail, you're cutting Head Start. I don't understand the argument.
No.
It's Head Start you're cutting in this bill.
So here's the-
I don't see
here's-
anything about
here's-
the Michelle Obama Trail in this bill.
But here's the well,
What
listen,
about the blood
there's
institute
nothing
in
about Head
Alabama?
Start in the bill either. It's saying, come to the negotiating table. We need to right-size the bureaucracy. We're talking about going back to 22 levels. We haven't put any caps for non-defense or defense. Come to the table and let's talk about how we prioritize for our country in the way that protects those vulnerable folks and programs that we think are important and critical, and let's look to the future so our children
I want to take a step back
That's
on that.
why this is an appropriations issue. It is not the aligning of the debt ceiling and appropriations. We make these decisions in appropriations all of the time. What are the trade-offs? What can we do and what we can't do? And with regard to community projects, you picked out 2 or 3. As the person who brought back community projects, I will just tell you, if you take a look at the community centers, at the Blood Institute in Alabama, if you look at the healthcare clinics, if you look at the Boys and Girls Clubs, et cetera, and what you would do with your 2022 numbers, you will cut back the community projects as well. Very dramatically cut the funding for community projects as well. Let us deal with appropriations as appropriations and not as part of holding the government hostage, the country hostage, with combining the debt ceiling with appropriations.
I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen.
I thank the chair. A couple of quick questions, well, really a question and then a comment. First, I want to thank each of the sponsors for their testimony today, and of course the ranking member as well for his testimony on a variety of different bills that obviously warrant our consideration. In particular, of course, with respect to the bill that's been offered by Representative Griffith, I co-chair the Fentanyl Prevention Caucus in the House, and so this is a subject I care deeply about and believe, as the ranking member said, that we need to implement a whole-of-government approach on a bipartisan basis to address the scourge of fentanyl that is devastating so many communities across the country, mine included. I wanted to ask you actually a question, not so much about the substance of your bill, but going to a point that my colleague articulated so well, Ms. Scanlon from Pennsylvania, and that is regarding the amendments. I'm sure you've seen there's a robust submission of amendments, and as my colleague on the other side of the aisle mentioned, we're going to have an opportunity to hear from sponsors on that front. I guess I just wonder, your personal opinion, do you think this committee should consider those amendments and have an opportunity to be able to, on the floor, give members an opportunity to have an up or down vote on some of the amendments that have been presented? And let me preface that with saying, I know there are some members on the other side of the aisle who earlier this year, during the process in which this Congress was initiated and the rules were adopted, that made much of supposed rule changes and trying to bring this institution back into a place in which there was open debate, and I count you among them. And I think you've always been intellectually honest on that front. And so I'm hopeful that you might provide this committee with some direction about considering the robust pool of amendments that have been proposed. Because I'm worried that as you exit the room, that my colleagues, unfortunately, on the other side of the aisle may become a bit reluctant.
Yeah, and I will just tell you, when you look at germaneness, there are different opinions on my side of the aisle too, but the reason, and I talked to the parliamentarians about it, the reason I got some language change was so that we could change that rule. It is my fervent belief that we need to change that rule and that the mechanism that was put in place allows us to change that rule. And what we should be looking at is, does the amendment directly impact what the bill's intent and purpose is? This bill's intent doesn't have anything to do with mandatory minimums. That's a completely different discussion. So I would submit to you that a large number of the amendments are not germane to the bill. And once people start getting used to figuring out how to draft under the new construct, draft those amendments, sure, I think we'll be in better shape. And the best place to start is right here in the Rules Committee. We will probably have some floor fights. I'm hopeful before the end of the year we'll have some floor fights over the defining of germaneness. I mean, what people don't seem to realize is that the precedents that are set are not there to bind us, but to guide us. And what we have done is we've gotten to a point where we're completely bound by precedents that in some cases don't make sense and have gotten too broad. We've allowed too much, in my opinion, on germaneness, which is why I fought to get some rules changes related to single purpose. This bill has a pretty straightforward single purpose. And I think that all of the mandatory minimum amendments are clearly not germane to the purpose and intent of this bill. This bill is about research and about scheduling fentanyl analogs, nothing else, not any other drug substance. not anything directly related to mandatory minimums, and therefore I believe that a lot
I
of
hear
those
you,
amendments
and
are
so,
not germane.
and I think you answered my question, so a couple of points I'd make. First, with respect to germaneness, my understanding is there wasn't an actual change to the rule, but nonetheless, let's just, I take you at your...
word's changed,
I hear you, I take you at your word, sir, and I guess what I'm asking about are the germane amendments. So there are many amendments that have been submitted by Republican members of your caucus that are germane to this bill. There are a few from Democrats as well, and I'm just asking you if you think we ought to be able to consider those amendments and have up or down votes, because to me, that would be consistent with your worldview that you've articulated previously.
If it is truly and not in violation of single purpose
Sure.
or germaneness, yes.
All right, well, I hope that the chair and your colleagues here will give you the courtesy of, adhering to that wise counsel that you've offered this committee, because there are a number of amendments, as I said, on both sides of the aisle, been submitted by members across the Congress that are germane, that I think merit consideration by the committee. Mr. Johnson, I want to just talk briefly about the CRA. And I guess I want to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly, because I had followed some of the debate in the Senate rather closely, Senator Fisher, of course, being the prime sponsor of the CRA that's now before the House. And my understanding of the argument that they made, I say they, maybe painted with a broad brush here, but several of the Republican senators who were championing this CRA, was the argument that emissions had improved pretty significantly over the course of the last several decades, certainly far different than the trucks that were being built in the 1990s. I assume you agree with that.
I do.
And is it your position that that change has nothing to do with the rule that was promulgated by the EPA in 2001?
What I can tell you is that we have already achieved a 98% reduction in NOx.
And why is that?
Since 1988. That's a long time before 2001.
Yeah.
And this rule outpaces available technology. The technology is not even there to do what they're proposing.
I hear your argument on that latter point, and I heard your testimony on that front, so I hear what you're saying. I'm taking a step back, because your argument seems different than the argument that was articulated in the Senate. Even in the Senate, the Republican senators, I think, were making the argument that the 2001 rule promulgated by the EPA ultimately enabled the industry to drastically improve the emissions over the course of the ensuing 2 decades, right, 20 years.
I wouldn't dare say that it didn't have any effect, but I would also, without qualification, say it didn't have the total effect. Some of this came from industry.
I'm not saying it had a total effect, but I am saying that the empirical studies and certainly the EPA's data that it's published and your colleagues in the Senate who support the CRA, they all concede that the 2001 rule had a substantial impact in decreasing emissions. And they nonetheless support the CRA for the reasons that you've articulated around technology, and I heard your testimony in that front. But for me, I guess what is a bit confounding is to have folks who bemoan regulation and demand that we don't move forward with this regulation, which we know, based on the analysis that the EPA has done, will save lives, will reduce cases of childhood asthma across the country, in Ohio, in western and northern Colorado, where I hail from, and would save ultimately billions of dollars over the course of the long haul going into 2045, that we shouldn't pursue the rule change because it won't be effective. And yet, they cite as justification the fact that the prior rule that the EPA promulgated in 2001 was in fact effective. And, and who knew that ultimately it would have an impact, as it did. Ranking Member Pallone, do you care to expound on any of this?
I just want to say this, and maybe I just keep coming here for these CRAs and I'm getting disgusted with it, but I mean, it just seems like, I know you guys are going to take this in the wrong way, but look, we have a committee that deals with all these pollution issues, EPA, health issues, safety, whatever. To me, using the CRA process, which precludes any further regulation in this space, is not the way to proceed legislatively around here. What I'm seeing is more and more Republican, the majority, bringing to the floor these CRAs that preclude, if they were ultimately signed into law, that would preclude us dealing with all these health and safety issues. It's not the way to legislate. I mean, I don't think anyone, I don't think Mr. Johnson is suggesting that we shouldn't be doing something about heavy-duty trucks now or in the future. Yet if you pass this thing and it became law, we wouldn't be able to do that. And I know that's not what you wanted me to discuss, but I mean, I just want to say it's getting to the point where every week there's another CRA, and the consequence of all this, if it actually became law, would be devastating to health and safety for the country.
No, you raise a great point, Ranking Member Pallone, and Mr. Johnson, to the extent that you would care to respond on this front, I would certainly welcome it. Well, let me give you a question here and throw it your way, and then you can respond, because the ranking member raises a really interesting point. Sitting on this committee, we've done a lot of CRAs. It has been a CRA-intensive start to the 118th Congress, which I suspect some folks on your side of the aisle take pride in. And what I would say is you've served in Congress long. I'm looking at Mr. Massey, it's big thumbs up. But I started my tenure in Congress in the 116th Congress. You've served, of course, longer than I have. When I started in the 116th Congress with my colleague, Ms. Scanlon, Donald Trump was president, as you might recall, 2019. The president, the administration, had promulgated hundreds of rules across a bevy of different federal agencies during the preceding 2 years. Do you know how many CRAs we considered in the 116th Congress? You and I.
Wow.
18 CRAs? Two CRAs in the 116th Congress. Two. So, again,
I'd have to go back and look.
You can check the notes, and we'll be here for a while. To Ranking Member Pallone's point, the CRA is a hammer, right, as opposed to a finely tuned scalpel as we're addressing some of these really nuanced policy challenges. And I think they are best reserved for thoughtful consideration in the subcommittee that you chair, in the full committee that Ranking Member Pallone serves on, rather than just doing a CRA basically every week. I mean, it's got a lot of challenges that we're facing as a country. Would like to be able to consider legislation like your colleague, Mr. Griffith's legislation on fentanyl, which I appreciate, him bringing forward in front of this committee. So anyway, I'm happy to give you a chance to respond, but
Yeah.
of course.
Well, first of all, let me say that the CRA process, I think, is there for a reason. It's part and parcel to Congress's oversight responsibility of the administration, and sometimes, given the criticality of the issue, I think a CRA is the appropriate way to go. And quite honestly, I've been here for 13 years. I don't think we've considered that many CRAs since I've been here in 13 years. And the ones that we did were very important ones. The other thing that
From
I would like to
19,
point
if
out,
I might just comment there, I'll give you a chance.
If I might finish.
Sure.
One of the main reasons why this one is so important is because the rule is not going to accomplish what the EPA is trying to accomplish. They've admitted that this thing is going to cost somewhere between 39 and 55 billion, which the cost is largely going to be borne by the American consumers, because small and independent truck fleet owners are not going to be able to afford to go to these newer trucks with the $8,000 cost associated with them, or the $2,000 for the F-250. And so they're going to stay with the old technology, so we're going to keep the old trucks on the road longer, and so we're going to actually slow down the process of reducing NOx emissions.
And I hear your argument, Mr. Johnson. The EPA clearly has a different view, but with respect to the CRA, just because you're actually right on this point. I don't know how long you served in Congress. I know, again, this was longer than I have, but CRA was adopted by Congress in 1996. It wasn't used a single time until 2017. So you're right. For the vast majority.
Yeah, I was the one that introduced it, to get rid of the string protection rule, and I'm sure as hell glad that I did.
Well, and look, no one's making that case. No one's arguing that the CRA isn't a tool that should and can be used by the Congress from time to time. What I am saying is that the House Republican majority has chosen to spend its very limited floor time on 6 CRAs over the course of the last 4 months, which is 3 times the amount of CRAs that were considered when House, hold on, Mr. Johnson, I let you finish, I'm going to finish my statement, that House Democrats utilized during the course of the final 2 years of the Trump presidency. And so, look, I mean, I go back to Mr. Griffith's comments about, I think returning this place to regular order and applying sort of an institutionalist view to the Congress. If this is the system, and we're just going to have a Congress, as it switches back and forth and the political winds shift, and we'll consider 10 to 20, 30, 40 CRAs every year, depending on which party's in power, I guess that's the system that some would like to adopt. I don't think it's a particularly productive system. That's the point I'm making. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman, may I respond to that last?
I'm happy to. I'm sorry. I'm happy to yield to you, of course.
I would say that there is certainly a time and a place for CRAs, and I think one of the reasons why you see this one, and I'm sure this is going to generate a lot more discussion. We had the best economy that we'd had in 50 years under the previous administration. Today, we got the highest inflation that we've had in more than 40 years. There's a reason to pull back on the regulations coming out of the Biden administration, and the CRA is a valid way to do it, and that's what we should do.
Well, I will just say, since we're here on the dais and we like to have the last word, because I wanted to give you an opportunity, but the response I don't think was germane to the argument that I was making. So I will simply conclude by saying it seems to me that your view, pretty clearly, is a CRA a month, 2 CRAs a month, 3 CRAs a month. We should just keep doing CRAs, and that is fine. You're entitled to that view. I don't think it's a particularly productive way for us to do our business. We're going to have an opportunity in a minute, Mr. Massey. Why give you that time now? And again, we could talk about the merits about the rule as well, as I said, and the various ways in which I think it will benefit the American public. Obviously, we have a disagreement about that on the merits. But with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be brief. I know votes are called, so I will skip the questions that I had planned just to simply say first, thank you to Mr. Godus for being here, for your support of the Forest Service Flexible Housing Partnerships Act of 2023, and of course for the work that you do at the Colorado Association of Ski Towns. And as a representative who represents many of the communities, of course, that are members of your organization and home, in my view, the 2nd District to the best ski resorts and ski resort communities in the country. It's a pleasure to be able to have you before this committee. And this bill, I think, couldn't be more important for the reasons that you stated during the course of your testimony. The ability to provide affordable housing options for our Forest Service workers, for our wildland firefighters, for first responders, just very important. And I think this bill is a common sense way to accomplish that, and a way for us as a Congress on a bipartisan basis to support those efforts at the local level. So proud of the bill, and again, grateful for you being here. And then to Ms. Duncan, thank you for being here. It's wonderful to see you again, and certainly we're grateful for the work that you are doing on behalf of wildland firefighters, and I couldn't agree with you more in response to Chairman Westerman's question. We all know there is a serious pay cliff approaching. The clock is ticking. We have limited time to address it. And I have been beating the drum here in Congress, of course, for years with respect to the comprehensive reforms that I think we need to get done as described and articulated in my bill and Tim's Act that we've spoken about, and of course you all have advocated for. But in addition to that bill, we've got to get this pay cliff resolved. And I just hope that we can work on a bipartisan basis, Mr. Chairman, both within this subcommittee, within the larger full committee, and of course with our partners in the Government Oversight and Reform Committee to get this done. Because a lot of wildland firefighters across the country who bravely sacrifice so much on our behalf are counting on us to get it done and to get it right. So no questions, but again, just want to thank you, Ms. Duncan, Mr. Godus, and all of the witnesses for their testimony. I yield back.
For the panel.
I thank the chairman. A couple questions on the substance of the proposal, but first I want to talk a bit about process. So grateful to have each of the witnesses here from the various committees of jurisdiction. I must say I'm a bit struck by some of the comments that have been made both by the witnesses and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. In a normal negotiation, one would expect that a party that had just successfully negotiated an agreement with another party would be proud of that negotiated product, might be a bit magnanimous, might concede that both parties in the negotiation were able to get something out of the deal and ultimately are committed to moving forward for the benefit of the American people, with the exception of perhaps Mr. Estes. And so I'm not going to include him in this broad brush because I think his remarks are a bit more tempered. I have yet to see any of that from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. It strikes me the only person who's being magnanimous about any of this is President Biden, who has taken that approach during the pendency of these negotiations. Why are we here at this hour? Because Republicans have brought us to the brink of a potential default, the first in our country's history. And as the chairman, or the former chairman, our ranking member, so eloquently noted in the beginning, this is a manufactured crisis. No question about it. House Republicans are in control. You have the gavels. You are in the majority. And the fact that we are now a mere few days from a potential default because the majority has decided to engage in this hostage-taking that my colleagues have described, I think, is a dangerous harbinger for how this body may function into the future. Now, I heard a number of my colleagues, and I was a bit surprised to hear the chairman use some of these phrases, sort of laying blame at the president and describe, I think he used the word dithering and long delays. I hope we can certainly disabuse the American public of any of these exaggerations and, in my view, falsehoods around the nature of the negotiations that have taken place. The president put forward a budget months ago. Mr. Chairman, Chairman Smith, do you know when the president submitted his budget to the United States Congress?
I don't remember, but it was
March 9th.
It was late. It was due February 1st.
Oh, I'm glad you noted that. Chairman Smith, when did the Republicans submit their budget?
You would need to ask the budget.
I would need to ask the budget chair. Well, Mr. Estes, when did the Republicans submit their budget? Only in the Rules Committee, by the way, could a witness lay blame at the president for being a few weeks late in submitting his budget when his party hasn't submitted a budget, period. I don't know if I'm living in the twilight zone. I mean, again, I'm not suggesting that, that one cannot make points, substantive points, and have reasonable disagreement about the merits of the underlying proposal. But what I take issue with is this kind of constant scorched earth mentality of, again, laying blame at the White House at every turn, notwithstanding that this is a deal that your party has negotiated with the White House. Republicans didn't submit a budget. They filed their bill, the Default on America Act. I understand you have a different name for it. Chairman Smith, when was that bill filed?
I don't know what you mean, the Default America
The Save,
Act.
Limit, Grow Act, when was that submitted to the Congress?
Oh, that's clearly not the bill that you were just talking about. The Limit, Save, Grow Act was passed out of Congress in April.
April 25th is when it was introduced. So the president puts forward his budget in early March. He tells House Republicans and Speaker McCarthy, put forward your budget, put forward your proposal, and let's have a conversation.
A budget is
Mr.
not a
Smith,
debt limit.
It's
two different
I'm going to claim my time, and you'll have an opportunity to respond at the end. The president submits the budget, gives Republicans an opportunity. Republicans don't file it. Mid-March, late March, early April, the House adjourns for a 2-week break. Mid-April, still nothing. Finally, House Republicans introduce their bill, not a budget, blueprint, but a bill. They pass it that same week, and then the House adjourns for another recess. The day the House comes back, the president brings forth the Speaker, the Senate leadership, and the Minority Leader of the House to have a conversation about resolving the impasse. So again, facts are facts. Obviously, we're going to have disagreements about the propriety of the spending cuts or revenue decisions with respect to the underlying bill that's being proposed today. But let us dispense with the blame around delays that, unfortunately, my colleagues have been so stuck on. Now, Ranking Member Boyle, you said something that I thought was important for folks who are tuning in, and of course, usually we don't have this much media in the Rules Committee. It's often we don't have these kinds of interesting hearings, and I suppose, again, it's because the stakes are so high. But this is not the first time that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle have decided to engage in this kind of hostage-taking. We were here, not you and I, but the Congress was here, the American people were here a decade ago when they did this previously. And I guess I wonder if you might expound a bit on what this type of hostage-taking suggests may be in our future to the extent that it continues to happen.
Yeah, Mr. Neguse, that is correct. In the summer of 2011, unlike any other period, even though the debt limit itself has existed since World War I, and even in its modern form since the late 1930s, really 2011 was a milestone, because that's the first time in the history of the debt ceiling we saw one party weaponize it to such a degree. It roiled the markets. They dropped, I believe, 17%, including 5% in one day. And even though the debt ceiling was ultimately raised, by coming within just a few days of deadline, it led to the first ever downgrade in American history. Downgrade was done by Standard & Poor's. GAO has subsequently found it has increased our borrowing costs by billions of dollars. So after all of that turmoil and after all of that tumult, it actually ended up increasing the national debt and increasing the cost to taxpayers. It also created a dangerous precedent that now this Republican majority, again with a House Republican majority and a Democrat in the White House, they decided to follow that 2011 game plan. So we had been put on warning by at least one credit agency that we may face another downgrade. You know, the reality is, the more this goes on and the more this goes on, first, as I mentioned before, we tempt fate that we will actually go over the cliff and bring the global economy with it. But we also run the risk that we will one day not be the reserve currency of the world. The reason why our interest rates are so low comparatively is because we are a safe haven for investment for the rest of the world. These sort of antics increasingly bring that into doubt, whether or not folks will get their money, the folks who are lending to us. So this is it's a dangerous pattern that was really created in 2011. This has been another major milestone when it comes to the debt ceiling. And I'm truly worried in terms of what the future looks like if we don't dramatically change this system.
Well, I thank the ranking member. I share your sentiments, and I think one benefit of this legislation, to President Biden's credit, is that it takes this kind of hostage-taking off of the table for the duration of the 118th Congress by virtue of the limit being extended through January of 2025. But nonetheless, this isn't sustainable. And Ranking Member McGovern's warnings, I think, are prescient. And I would challenge my Republican colleagues to recognize those warnings, to be cognizant of that, because clearly if this becomes the precedent, irrespective of which party might be in power in Washington or the political affiliation of the president at a given time, to the extent the debt ceiling is up, it will incentivize this kind of hostage-taking into the future. Now, in terms of the substance of the proposal, again, I'll perhaps go to you, Chairman Smith, because I think, again, Mr. Estes, you described a variety of the different provisions in the bill, at least some of those, in ways that I think are consistent with the underlying language of the bill. And this bill is not perfect by any stretch. There are a variety of provisions that I certainly disagree with. But I do think the bill, on balance, does a number of things. One, it averts catastrophic default. As Ranking Member Boyle articulated, the consequences of a default on our debt would be devastating to everyday Americans across our country, in Kansas and Colorado, everywhere. Two, it, as I said, takes the hostage-taking off of the table for the duration of this Congress. And then finally, it protects core American programs for a lot of Americans. Social Security, Medicare, veterans benefits, programs that House Democrats have been fighting to protect and have successfully protected over the course of these last 30 days, evident by the bill that we have before us. I was a bit surprised, Chairman Smith, when our chairman, Chairman Cole, asked the question of you to essentially describe the parallels, or this wrong phrase, similarities between the limit, your April bill, I'm forgetting the phraseology here, Save, Grow, Limit, bill that you all introduced in April, and this bill. And your response was, I wrote it down because I was so struck by it. You said, you can go, quote, line by line. I've spent the last couple of days reviewing this bill since the legislative text was released. So I have done that. I suspect many of my colleagues have as well. And what I see certainly doesn't comport with the bill that was passed back in April. Medicaid. This agreement doesn't include any changes to the work requirements for Medicaid, which your bill, the April bill, did. As we know, it would ultimately put at risk 21 million Americans in terms of potentially losing Medicaid. This bill does not do that. This bill, as you said, includes a rescission of IRS funding, and Ranking Member Designee Thompson explained this as well, of $1.4 billion. My read of the April bill that you had proposed was a $180 billion rescission. Am I using the right number, or is that incorrect?
180 billion, more like 72 billion.
72 billion. Okay, so $1.4 billion versus $72 billion. Those two numbers don't strike me as similar. I mean, if you were going to ask me and say, are these two numbers similar, I would say no. But anyway, we can go down the list line by line. Fully funding veterans' medical care. We call it, the Default America Act, cut $200 million for VA research, $1.2 billion for VA technical research. This bill fully funds medical care for veterans, including the funding, as Ranking Member Boyle said, for the PACT Act's Toxic Exposure Fund at the levels that were included in the President's fiscal year 2024 budget. SNAP eligibility. This bill includes SNAP eligibility for veterans, for those who are homeless, a variety of different vulnerable people, understanding the change that you articulated in your colloquy with Mr. Cole, with Chairman Cole. But in addition to those changes you described, and I'm not taking issue with, well, I take issue perhaps substantively with them, I'm not taking issue with your description of them, but I am simply saying alongside those, adjacent to those, there is the reality that this bill does in fact expand SNAP for certain veterans. And so I guess my point here, again, perhaps leaning on something that, or a theme, I suppose, that Mr. Thompson, Mr. Estes, and Mr. Boyle, I think all touched on, which is that this is a compromise measure. Not everybody got what they wanted. It's not perfect, but ultimately it will avert a disastrous default, and it protects core programs that are going to benefit a lot of Americans. And I was hopeful that that would be the enduring theme of this particular hearing, given that this is a bill that Speaker McCarthy and his party, ostensibly, or at least on his party's behalf, negotiated with the president. And it's unfortunate that it hasn't been the tone, but nonetheless, we'll do my best to try to bring that to bear here. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized for any questions she might have for the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized. I thank the chairman. Mr. Durham, thank you for testifying today. Thank you for your service to
been a real pleasure.
Our country. Well, we appreciate your service to our country, to the Department of Justice. I've read your report, as I suspect most of the members of the committee have, and appreciated your work. I want to talk a bit about your interactions with Maine Justice, with the Department of Justice, and in particular with Attorney General Garland. Did Attorney General Garland permit your inquiry to proceed independently?
Yes.
Did Attorney General Garland interfere with your inquiry, your investigation in any way?
No.
Did Attorney General Garland attempt to prevent or stop you or your team from taking any investigative step that you deemed necessary?
He did not.
Did Attorney General Garland provide support to your efforts?
In terms of occasionally we would need some additional personnel. In a couple of instances, we had a person that was detailed from Maine Justice. Yes, so in that respect, yes.
Did Attorney General Garland decline to implement any of the recommendations that you've made?
I don't know that.
The letter, the report, I believe it's on page 3 of your report, you say, and I'll quote, "After the inauguration of President Biden, Attorney General Garland met with the Office of the Special Counsel. The office very much appreciates the support consistent with his testimony," referring to Attorney General Garland, "during his confirmation hearings that the Attorney General has provided to our efforts and the department's willingness to allow us to operate independently," end quote. And you stand by that, I suspect.
I do.
Correct. Sounds like the Department of Justice and the Attorney General were supportive of your efforts, did not interfere in any way with the work that you did over the course of the last several years. There are some folks here in Congress, some colleagues of mine on the other side of the aisle, who have talked about or indicated their desire to defund the Department of Justice. Do you believe the Department of Justice should be defunded?
I don't believe these discussions about defunding the police make any sense at all for the security of the nation, and I don't think defunding cornerstone law enforcement entities make a whole lot of sense. Maybe more oversight, but defunding in our cities and streets and so forth, no, that doesn't make sense to me. But I've only been at this for 40 years.
Sure. Well, and as I said, I am grateful to your service, and for your service, rather, and I guess I just want to put a finer point on it because I guess I didn't hear that in your answer. You said a cornerstone of law enforcement. I take that you mean the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice obviously should not be defunded, right? You've committed your career to the Department of Justice. You were a former U.S. attorney, a former acting U.S. attorney, 35 years as an assistant U.S. attorney. You have a decorated record of service to the department. I'm hoping you're willing to say on the record clearly that you don't believe the department should be defunded.
I don't believe the Department of Justice or the FBI should be defunded. I think there ought to be some changes and the like, but defunded, no.
Thank you. And I appreciate your candor. And I agree with you. With respect to the Office of the Special Counsel, of course, you've concluded your service. As you know, there are different special counsels that are appointed from time to time. You've served in that capacity multiple times yourselves. There is discussion of defunding special counsels. Do you support more broadly the principle of defunding the Office of the Special Counsel?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would have to know the particulars of what the discussion is, but I mean, the general notion that you would establish a special counsel office, the special counsel is doing an investigation, then you're going to defund it, would not make sense to me.
Yeah, I agree. And just to put a finer point on this, you served as special counsel for a period of years. During the course of your investigation, for the bulk of that time, Democrats were in control of the United States House of Representatives. There was no effort that I'm aware of to defund your office. And I assume that you would have construed that if someone had made an effort to defund the Office of Special Counsel, your office, as you were undertaking your investigation, as political interference, to the extent that that was being done to try to impair or impinge on your investigation. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, I mean, if it were our office, our team, I guess I'd have to know the basis of that to see if I thought it was, political or that,
let's say it's because people
spending too much money.
Sure. Let's say it's because people disagreed with the work that you were doing. They didn't like your investigation. They disagreed fundamentally with decisions you were making. I presume you would construe that as political interference.
Special counsel should operate independently. That's the whole purpose of special counsel. So,
I certainly agree. And again, I thank you for being here. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, thank you for being here. Thank you for your testimony. And thank you for your service to our country under some pretty difficult circumstances. And we're certainly grateful. I'm certainly grateful. The people of the state that I represent, Colorado, are grateful to the 38,000 members of the FBI team, as you have articulated. that are working every day to keep the American people safe and to keep the people of my state and my community safe. So we're grateful for you being here. This committee obviously has a legitimate role in terms of conducting oversight. Generally, that oversight has extended to the policy areas, the areas of law enforcement that, of course, you are responsible for. Unfortunately, much of the conversation today, and it's disappointing, I think, for those Americans who have been watching, has not been focused on those legitimate areas of inquiry, but instead conspiracy theories and the like. Obviously, as you have been given an opportunity to respond to some of the attacks that have been made against the law enforcement agency that you direct, and the dangerous calls, or at least in my view, the dangerous calls that have been made by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle in terms of defunding federal law enforcement, which is deeply dangerous, and you've articulated the many reasons why. I'd like to focus in on two areas that are important to my constituents in Colorado and that I believe are relevant to the work that you do, and that is the fentanyl epidemic and gun violence prevention. With respect to the latter, you may recall you testified in front of the committee previously. I had an opportunity to ask you about an incident that occurred back in 2020 in my state in Colorado. In 2021, the GAO issued a report in response to this particular incident. Just by way of background, a gun dealer in Colorado transferred a firearm to an 18-year-old resident of Florida without first verifying the purchaser's age eligibility in her state of residence. The gun buyer then threatened to commit a school shooting akin to the mass tragedy that occurred at Columbine High, causing the lockdown and closure of multiple schools in my district back in Colorado. The report recommended, the GAO report, that the FBI strengthen its system for the sale of firearms to out-of-state purchasers. Specifically, it recommended that the FBI update the NICS system to verify the age requirements of an out-of-state firearm purchaser in both the purchaser's state of residence and the state of sale to ensure basic age eligibility. And we've introduced legislation that I believe the Department of Justice is aware of to make that requirement statutory. Wonder if you could expound a bit on whether I'm sure you're aware of the report, whether the FBI has implemented the recommendation that the GAO has made, and if not, the FBI's plans to do so.
Well, I think the specific legislation that would require that is something, as you said, that I think the department is studying, and so I can't weigh in on a specific legislative proposal. When it comes to the specific issue of 18 to 20-year-olds in particular and gun purchases, that is, of course, the subject of the bipartisan Safer Communities Act that was passed. And there are a number of significant checks that now occur. We started implementing that last October, fully implemented it starting in January. And that provides for enhanced checks for that critical population, the 18 to 20-year-old range, juvenile criminal records, mental health records for that population, and contact, in some ways, most importantly, contact with local law enforcement in that person's community. And I've actually been out to NICS, met with and sat with the operators who process those checks. So I've seen kind of firsthand how it works and the important work it represents. And I think if you were to talk, I'm talking to chiefs and sheriffs all over this country every week, and you will hear from most of them, if you talk to them for very long, you will hear about their concern and our concern about juveniles and violence. I almost guarantee you within the first 10 minutes of any conversation. It's a real problem in this country.
Well, I thank you for your answer, and I think it underscores the importance of the NICS program, and would look forward to perhaps following up with your team on this particular administrative issue of trying to just make sure that the database is working efficiently. Limited time left, but I just want to give you an opportunity. I know we've talked a bit about the fentanyl epidemic devastating communities across the country, certainly in Colorado. It's one of the reasons why we created a fentanyl prevention caucus here in the Congress. It's bipartisan. Representative Issa is one of our co-chairs. Wonder if you just might be able to, for those Americans who are watching, kind of provide us with your sense of some of the trends, the most dangerous and disturbing trends that you think the American people and policymakers should be aware of.
Well, I will say there are a whole bunch of trends, but in the limited time, but because of the importance of this topic, I'll hit a couple. One is, and we were just discussing this recently internally, we are finding over the course of the last year that, maybe even a little less than a year, that almost every gang takedown we have now, and we're doing them all over the country all the time, almost every single one now seems to involve as well a seizure of fentanyl. And we've been doing gang takedowns since Congresswoman Lee was a prosecutor as well. And so that's not new. But what is new is that over and over and over again, it seems consistently we're finding fentanyl in these, again, these are violent crime takedowns. The second phenomenon, which is deeply disturbing, and I know the DEA administrator is very concerned about as well, is that we're seeing more and more adulteration or lacing of fentanyl into all sorts of different kinds of prescription drugs that lots of Americans take all the time. And if you think about the phenomenon of the youth of this country, which is itself a problem of getting prescription drugs from their friends or their friends' parents or whatever it happens to be, they may not know that there's potentially a lethal dose of fentanyl in some prescription drug that they're taking. So it just underscores the importance of only getting your prescriptions from an appropriate medical provider.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Is a Southern. Very much. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for any questions he cares to put to the panel.
Thank the chairman. Thank you, Madam Chair, Mr. Ranking Member, for being here today, for testifying on the bill before us. Madam Chair, do you believe that this bill should apply to private schools?
Well, I don't know of any instance where they're trying to put illegal aliens into private schools. We're dealing with taxpayer dollars here.
Got it. So just to ask you a question again, I get maybe misunderstood the question. Do you think this should apply to private schools? Let me give you some context. One of your colleagues, Representative Balatakis, I believe, has filed an amendment that would make this bill ultimately apply to private schools that receive federal funding on this legislation. I'm just curious. It's not a trick question. I'm wondering, you're the chairwoman of this committee. Do you support that amendment or do you not support it?
My understanding is that amendment was withdrawn.
So you won't answer the question as to whether or not you believe private schools should be covered under this legislation?
It's not the issue at hand.
Okay, well, it's quite ironic indeed. It is odd to me that you declined to express an opinion on that. You could simply say, I don't think that it should apply to private schools. You might have a rationale for that, or you could say, I think it should, but an amendment wasn't submitted. But in any event, we'll move on if that, to the extent that that's clearly something you don't want to answer. I think I know the reason why. How many markups has your committee held in the last 6 months? We're getting close to the August recess here, another 10 days or so, or I guess 8 days.
Sorry, I don't know exactly how many. We've held a lot.
You've held a lot?
I can get you the number.
Your team is here. I mean, is it more than 5, more than 10? I mean, it can't be.
I don't know exactly how many.
I think they're trying to get your attention here. I think they have a number they can give to you.
5.
5. That doesn't sound like a lot, but 5. Okay, so 5 markups. I was expecting you to say 50 or 100 or 25 or 10, but okay, 5.
Well, we've had a lot of hearings.
I'm sure you have. Of the 5 markups, any bills on teacher pay that you've marked up?
No, because the federal government is not involved in that issue. It's not the role of the federal government to be involved with teacher pay.
Not the role of the federal government to be involved in teacher pay. Okay, good to know. Have you had any markups on student safety, school shootings, hardening schools, taking actions to better protect our students in light of growing violence?
We have not had a markup.
No markups on that. Any markups on extending learning time for students that are struggling with learning loss following the pandemic? As you've noted, a lot of students ultimately fell behind as a result of the pandemic. I wonder if any bills around.
No markup on that.
No markups on that. So, and any markups on school meals, issues around school meals? Obviously, hunger in schools, kind of an issue that you might have heard of. I know you're familiar with it. I'm just curious if there's been a markup on that.
No, but there will be. We will be working on it.
I'm glad to hear that. I hope that can be scheduled soon because it's a pressing issue in my district and in Colorado. Look, the reason I asked this question, Madam Chair, and I think you've answered it for me, 8 months under Republican control of the House, no markups on school safety, no markups on teacher pay, no markups on hunger in schools, no markups on trying to address learning gaps as a result of the pandemic. Apparently, on the notion of teacher pay, according to the chairwoman, completely impermissible for this committee to hold a hearing on that. That isn't a matter for the federal government to be concerned with. But telling local school districts back in North Carolina or in Virginia or in Colorado what to do with their buildings, somehow that is a matter of province, of federal jurisdiction. But the issue around paying teachers is not? Is that the argument that I guess you're making today? I'm trying to understand how those two things can both be true. That the Education Committee should have no role in teacher pay, but should tell every school district in the United States of America what they can and cannot do with their buildings. Is that the committee's position?
Right now, we have a crisis at our border, as we're told by everyone, and we have the possibility of illegal aliens being housed in buildings, mostly adults, where very close to where children might be. You could consider that a school safety issue, and we do consider it a school safety issue. So you might want to look at it that way. So yes, we're dealing with school safety. If you have adult males in close proximity, we have no idea who they are, what their backgrounds are, you could consider that a school safety
Ms. Fox, you heard the question. That wasn't the question. The question was, is it the committee's position that the federal government has no role to play with respect to teacher pay and has every role to play with respect to telling these school districts and schools what they can and cannot do with their facilities? And it sounds like the answer is yes. And if the answer is yes, you can say yes. That can be your position.
We do not have a role to play in teacher pay. That is not our role. We have a role into considering about school safety, which is saying we have not. And this is a school
I think the American public would be mighty frustrated were they to realize the ways in which the Republicans in Congress have constricted the committee's jurisdiction so that the Education Committee is no longer a place that can hold hearings and inquiries as to how to help ensure that public school teachers can afford to live in the communities that they call home, as Ranking Member Scott did in the last Congress, holding a markup on that very subject, or enabling the committee to hear about student hunger so that students are actually fed and don't go hungry, or taking steps, by the way, bipartisan steps, to try to protect our schools in light of the growing threat of violence in terms of school shootings. Apparently, all of that is off the table for this Education Committee. And instead, we get bills like this one. And I think it's deeply disappointing. I suspect the American people will feel the same way. I also find it deeply ironic that the same group of my colleagues, and not all of them, but many of them, who bemoan any role for the federal government in education policy, who disclaim any ability for the Secretary of Education to have a role in secondary schools, to now say that there's an exception and that this is it. Did you vote, Madam Chair? There was an amendment, you probably recall this, about a month ago. I think it was a month ago. Time has flown by here the last couple of months. To abolish the Department of Education. I think it was to terminate the Department of Education. Did you vote for that amendment?
I'm sorry, I don't remember that amendment.
There was an amendment during a bill that you brought before this committee regarding sports and Title IX. And the amendment to that bill was brought by a gentleman on this committee, Mr. Massey. He's not here to defend the propriety of his amendment, but there are other colleagues of his who are here who co-sponsored that amendment. I believe 164 Republicans voted for it, and I'm wondering if you were among them.
I don't know, but I would, if the Lord put me in charge, I would get the federal government out of education in a heartbeat, because it's not delineated.
This seems like an awfully odd way to do that, Ms. Fox. Madam Chair, with all respect, that's what I'm saying. You did vote. My understanding is you voted for this amendment to terminate the Department of Education. That's consistent with what you just said in terms of, if you had your ability to do that, you'd abolish it. And if that's the case, I'm not sure why you keep bringing bills to this committee to give the Department of Education and the Secretary of Education more powers over local schools in North Carolina and every other state in the country. It is an odd way to remove the federal government from education policy, but that's your prerogative as chair, and I'm not going to get in your way. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Colorado for questions.
Thank you. I thank the chairman. Thank you, Judge, for being here today and for your team. And I certainly have great respect for you and for the ranking member on your subcommittee, whom I know wished that she could be here. And she's spoken glowingly of you in terms of the work that you all have done together in the past. But we have a job to do here, which is ensuring that we review every bill that comes through the Rules Committee before it gets to the floor and that they're appropriately vetted. And so in that regard, I want to just ask a couple of quick questions about the bill that you've submitted to the committee on military construction. I know you agree with me, military construction is an incredibly important priority within this larger bill, right?
Absolutely.
And I read a report recently suggested 30% of our military infrastructure worldwide is in poor condition, which means...
Probably correct.
Probably correct. So funding military construction, incredibly important to the national security of our country. Last year, when House Democrats were in charge of the House, we allocated, ultimately was signed into law, $19 billion for the military construction piece of this bill. Does that sound about right?
I think you're right, but I'm not positive. I'll take your word for it.
I appreciate it, Judge. And this year, you have allocated $17.7 billion in the budget for military construction. Okay, so that's lower. That's a cut of $1.3 billion in military construction that your budget submits. Is that right?
Actually, we're following the, I don't like people sneaking up behind me.
That's all right. You were saying?
Yes, theoretically it is.
Well, I mean, I don't...
funded all the, more than the president asked for.
I guess I'm trying to understand. You're saying theoretically. Last year, the United States military had $19 billion to spend on military construction. This is for example, housing for our service members. This year, if your bill passes the House and passes the Senate and is signed into law, there will be $17.7 billion for military construction.
Correct.
So $1.3 billion less for military construction, service members' housing, by way of example, than the last year, right?
Right.
Okay. Military infrastructure backlog. I'm sure you agree with me, Judge, and you've been working on these issues a lot longer than I have. Large backlog for military infrastructure. According to the Department of Defense, about $100 billion. That seem about right?
Wouldn't know the number. It's large.
Okay.
It's large.
Well, I can
Large
represent.
need.
I can represent to you it's a big number.
Well,
President Biden made a request in his budget request that he submitted to Congress for a specific allocation to start addressing that backlog. He asked for $2 billion. How much did your subcommittee allocate for military infrastructure backlog to start chipping away at that? I can tell you, Judge, the answer is zero. There's no money in the budget proposal that you've submitted to us to start chipping away at that infrastructure backlog. President Biden asked for $2 billion. The subcommittee gave him zero.
okay, if you say that.
Okay, so military construction, $1.3 billion cut. Military infrastructure backlog, zeroed out, or zero in the request, or zero rather allocated. The BRAC account, base closure account, I know you're familiar with that.
I'm familiar with that very well.
Right, very much so, sir.
I've been through two BRAC.
Yes, sir, I'm sure.
How many have you been through?
Yes, sir. One of the accounts in BRAC, as I understand it, is for PFAS, remediation and cleanup. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I am.
Last year, House Democrats allocated $200 million in dedicated resources for PFAS cleanup. How much does this budget proposal include for dedicated PFAS cleanup?
There is nothing in this bill that requires or prohibits the government, the departments from addressing PFAS with the funds that they have. The department does not support budgeting by chemical.
So, and I understand, and I guess what I'm trying to get at, Judge, is there are differences, and I think you'd attest to this. There are differences between the budget you submitted to this committee and that your committee,
I can almost guarantee you.
from the budget that was passed last year, right? I mean, that's the nature of this.
I wouldn't
And
argue
so,
with Debbie or you or anybody else.
yes, sir. And all I'm
Our
trying
budget
to,
is more frugal than yours.
all I'm trying to do is glean, I think, for the American people and for members, the differences between the bill that you marked up in your committee and that we're going to consider and the bill that was passed last year. And I think we're in agreement here because you've given honest answers, and I appreciate that. I appreciate
I always give honest.
Yes, sir. I appreciate your candor. Military construction, $1.3 billion cut. Military infrastructure backlog. President requests $2 billion. This budget gives him none. And PFAS remediation, last year, $200 million direct, dedicated funding stream to clean up PFAS at sites across our country. This year, zero.
To clarify one thing.
Yes, sir.
We are 1.5 billion below FY '23.
Yes, I understand. That's what
Right.
as I said.
But we're 800 million above the budget request.
Yeah, but the difference is, and this is my point, and again, this is why we're having this exchange, is the way in which you've allocated dollars are differently. They don't reflect, in my view, the president's priorities, which is why he has indicated that he would veto his deep concerns about this legislation. Again, it's not, you made a judgment that there ought to be less money for military construction than was allocated last year when congressional Democrats were in charge. That's your prerogative.
No, I didn't make it that, I made a decision to spend it differently.
Sure, well, yeah, spend it differently, sure. So you took,
I'm looking at what's going on.
I hear you.
China,
I hear you.
And I'm beefing up the stuff in Hawaii, in Kwajalein, and in Guam.
Sure.
And that's very important.
I don't.
Those are fighting.
I don't disagree with you about the
Fighting
priorities.
platforms
But, sir, I think this
for our
is,
soldiers.
of course, and my point is we can do both. The only reason that you're not able to do both is because you have gone deeper than the original spending levels that had been negotiated with the President and Speaker McCarthy 3 months ago as part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act to avert the debt ceiling. So, I mean, we would like to do both, and you're only doing one. And, sir, I guess what I'm saying is you could say it's moving money around to a different priority. That's accurate. I'm just trying to give a sense to our colleagues about where the money is being moved from. And I think we're on the same page that military construction, housing for service members by way of example.
And we've done something for them in this bill too.
I understand, but they're getting a cut of $1.3 billion versus what was allocated in the last budget. That's the math. I'm not making these
I've
up.
actually been out there and started the fight to get it fixed up.
What was that?
I went out to start that fight on Fort Hood.
Yes, sir. I mean, the best way to do it, I think, would be to fund it at the level that we funded it at. I mean, that's the easiest way to solve this problem. I mean, look, Mr. Judge, the easiest way.
We have a reason we call ourselves Democrats and Republicans.
I hear you. I'm just saying the easiest way. I'll use PFAS again as an example.
Yes,
because,
I agree.
I mean, PFAS in Colorado, we've got 11 different places where these chemicals have been detected. We want them out of our state. We want that remediation to happen. Not next year, not 10 years from now, now. And the best way to do that, and by the way, there are members on this committee. I'm not the only member who has a military installation or a location within their district or their state where these substances have been detected. Shaw Air Force Base, I believe it. It's in South Carolina. Just recently, you have neighborhoods there who are using bottled water. I was just reading a news article about it, right? This bill does nothing to help them because at the end of the day, the PFAS remediation account, $200 million, dedicated funding that congressional Democrats fought for, has been zeroed out. And all I'm suggesting, Mr. Chair, is, because again, I know you to be an honorable man, and I know that you've worked with your ranking member in the past. And to our ranking member's point, and he articulated this in the beginning, this cannot be the way that I think you and me and others wanted this to end with a partisan bill, a bill that gets marked out on a completely partisan vote, a bill that is likely to be subject to a, again, completely partisan vote on the House floor, as opposed to something that could be developed in a bipartisan way. That's all I'm suggesting. And you don't have to answer that, but I think my sense is that you concur with me on that assessment. So in any event, we will fight for that $200 million, I should say, for PFAS remediation in the Senate. We'll do it. We'll fight for Shaw Air Force Base and the Colorado bases that are impacted, and every other base of a member on this committee, whether they vote for this bill, or excuse me, whether they vote against this bill, as I certainly intend to do, or not. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, I want to thank my friend and colleague from Pennsylvania for the respectful debate. I understand that we don't see eye to eye on the bills that this House will unfortunately be considering this week, but nonetheless appreciate his courtesy. Mr. Speaker, today marks 200 days since House Republicans gavelled us into this 118th session of the United States Congress. 200 days that they have been in control. 200 days that they have had the gavels here in Washington, D.C. The American people be justified in asking, how have House Republicans spent those 200 days? Any bills to address inflation, to lower costs for working families, any bills to grow the middle class, to build safer communities? The answer is none. Instead, they have pursued extreme policy after extreme policy. And this Milcon appropriation bill is no exception. Gas stoves, the northern eared bat, the lesser prairie chicken, and whatever other issue House Republicans conjure up when we are back in session. That's how they have chosen to spend their time and taxpayer dollars. When House Democrats were in control, working with President Biden and our colleagues in the upper chamber, we focused on issues that mattered to the American people. A bipartisan infrastructure law that unfortunately most of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle in this chamber voted against, that is rebuilding bridges and roads and highways across this country from Pennsylvania to Colorado, ensuring folks have clean water to drink and clean air to breathe. The PACT Act, the most comprehensive veterans health care legislation enacted in my lifetime, that 174 Republicans in this chamber voted against. The Inflation Reduction Act, capping insulin costs at $35 for seniors participating in Medicare across the country. That is how we spent our time. As I said earlier, we know that in 66 days, House Republicans will shut down the government. They are telegraphing that. Many of their members have said publicly that they want to shut down the government, that in their view, a shutdown of the government is the desired outcome. 66 days. And in 72 hours, Republicans will gavel this chamber out of session. They will adjourn this chamber for a 45-day recess. 45 days. 66 days until the government runs out of funding. 45-day recess. 72 hours until that recess. And we're here debating the lesser prairie chicken and the northern long-eared bat. It's deeply disappointing, and it does not comport with how the American public expects us to operate here in Washington, D.C. we can do better. And I would challenge my Republican colleagues to come back from the brink that I described earlier, work with us in good faith, help us deliver for the American people. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to vote no on this rule and to vote no on the underlying bills. If you support cutting military construction, if you support not addressing military infrastructure backlog, if you support zeroing out PFAS remediation, then by all means, vote for the Milcon bill. But if you oppose those draconian cuts, as I do, then I hope you'll vote no. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Colorado, who is a chair of the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee, Joe Neguse.
Well, thank you first and foremost to Vice Chair Lieu and to Chairman Aguilar for their leadership. I don't know that I could say any better than Chairman Aguilar did. 200 days. It's a long time. That's how long House Republicans have been in control here in the United States Congress. 200 days. And during those 200 days, what have they done for the American people to improve the lives of the people that we collectively represent? Absolutely nothing. No bills on lowering in healthcare costs, on addressing inflation, on growing the middle class, on raising wages, on school safety. None. Instead, we're left with hearings on gas stoves, 3 hearings on gas stoves, a bill this week on the long-eared bat. The House Republicans' priorities are completely distorted from the needs of the American people. And of course, it's no surprise because, as Chairman Aguilar said, the extreme wing of the House Republican caucus has taken control here in Washington, D.C. It is a shame. They said that they would strengthen America's economy, and instead, they threatened the full faith and credit of the United States of America during the manufactured default crisis. They said they would protect communities, and instead, they're now undermining our national security with dangerous bills that challenge and attack the freedoms of so many Americans. The American people expect us to do the people's business, and that's precisely what House Democrats did when we had the majority in the last Congress with the leadership of President Biden. It's the work that we continue to do today, to put people over politics, to lower costs, to grow the middle class, to build safer communities. And that's precisely what we will spend the month of August during this critical work period, communicating with our constituents, the work that we did on the PACT Act, and the importance of ensuring that veterans in our communities sign up for those life-saving benefits, the work that we've done to grow the middle class, to eliminate junk fees, and so much more. We will remain focused on the people's business because we put people over politics. We implore our Republican colleagues to start doing the same. With that, it gives me great privilege and honor to introduce our colleague from the great state of New York, the vice-ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, who has served with distinction in the Congress and our caucus, Grace Mank.
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the distinguished gentleman and my friend from Pennsylvania for the customary 30 minutes, and I too ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks, and will yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, as the gentleman said, today's rule provides for consideration of 3 bills. The first of those bills is H.R. 4366, the Military Construction, Veteran Affairs, and Related Agencies Appropriations Act of 2024. Now, Mr. Speaker, as you know, this bill typically is a bipartisan bill, one of the most bipartisan bills that we consider in the United States Congress. That is not the case this year. Why? Because House Republicans decided to inject extreme policy riders into this bill that threaten the freedoms of each and every American. They have kicked off appropriations season by doubling down on funding bills that endanger essential services. And just to speak frankly, this bill, nor any of the others that they will bring to the floor on the appropriations side, have any chance of becoming law. And my colleagues across the aisle know that. Today, they come to the floor and proudly tout a bill that would slash $1.3 billion from military construction. Not my number, their number. Programs that support quality of life services for members of the armed forces and their families. Democrats fight against cuts to vital programs that help the American people. Unfortunately, House Republicans are doing the opposite. We have seen this cycle many times, Mr. Speaker, throughout the last several months, 7 months. It has been hard to understand what my colleagues across the aisle truly want. At the beginning of this Congress, the other side of the aisle voted for a House rules package that promised an open rules process for amendments. Yet here we are debating another rule structured by Speaker McCarthy and Republican leadership. And now House Republicans threaten to shut down the government in order to fulfill an unpopular agenda full of far-right policy riders that undermine equal opportunity, restrict access to abortion, and more. We're going to hear a lot from my colleague, my friend on the other side of the aisle, about what he claims this bill will do. But it is important for the American people to understand 3 simple things. It cuts military construction by $1.3 billion. Think about the impact that will have, Mr. Speaker, on service members across the country. It funds no infrastructure backlog for the Department of Defense. Mr. Speaker, we have a $100 billion infrastructure backlog in the Department of Defense. Installations across the world, across the country, in our districts. The President asked for $2 billion to start to address that backlog. House Republicans said no. How much did they give? 0. And finally, the bill does nothing to address toxic PFAS contamination. Not a thing. Last year, House Democrats, under President Biden's leadership, appropriated $200 million towards PFAS remediation to address the toxic chemicals that are literally killing people across the country. This bill appropriates how much? None. Those are the facts. If that weren't enough, as the gentleman said, we're considering 2 other bills today. Now, the American people watching this might think that perhaps House Republicans would decide to bring a bill to the floor to lower costs, address inflation, try to reduce the cost of health care, grow the middle class, build safer communities, address school safety. No. House Republicans have declined to put any of those bills on the floor. Instead, what are we left with? Hearings and bills on gas stoves, and today, bills on the lesser prairie chicken and the northern long-eared bat. That's what we're here to debate, Mr. Speaker. I think the American people would be deeply disappointed at the choice and priorities that House Republicans are pursuing. Let's get back to the core issues at hand. Let's negotiate in good faith. Let's do the people's business. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'll reserve.
The gentleman reserves.
I yield to Congressman Mr. Neguse.
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank the gentlewoman, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. 16 days. 16 days. That's how much time we have left until the government runs out of funding. 6 weeks ago, Mr. Speaker, I stood here on the floor of the House with my colleagues as House Republicans gavelled the House out of session for a 45-day recess. Now, you may recall, Mr. Speaker, the priority that House Republicans were pursuing on that day as we gavelled out of session. I can assure you it was not to fund the government. It was instead a bill targeting the lesser prairie chicken and the long-eared bat. Literally. This came on the heels of a summer spent on Republican bills to protect gas stoves. 6 weeks later, we're back in Washington. Republicans have gavelled the Congress back into session. Here we are on the House floor yet again. And what are we spending our time doing? Perhaps a bill to fund the government? No. A bill to ensure that members of our armed forces are paid, that the operations of our government remain up and running? No. Instead, House Republicans choose to spend the time of this body debating a bill attacking electric vehicles. Electric vehicles, gas stoves, the long-eared bat, and the lesser prairie chicken. Those are the priorities of the House Republican caucus. 16 days away from a government shutdown. And this is how House Republicans choose to spend our time. The priorities that House Republicans are pursuing are grossly out of step with the priorities of the American people. You are in charge, Mr. Speaker. You could choose today to put bills on the floor to build safer communities, or lower costs, or grow the middle class. Instead, we're left with political games. Oh, that's right, and a baseless impeachment inquiry that the Speaker announced 48 hours ago. Maybe we can get back to the basic job of the U.S. House, of governing, of passing a budget. You know, Mr. Speaker, there's a good place to start. The Fiscal Responsibility Act that this body passed a mere 4 months ago set out negotiated spending levels. I don't know if the Speaker voted for it, but 149 of your colleagues did in the Republican caucus. The ranking member, my friend from Texas, he voted for it. And now, months later, the Republican caucus, the Speaker, they have abandoned, they have revoked, reneged on that deal. Why? Because the far-right members of their caucus have demanded it. And so here we are, 16 days away from a government shutdown that many members of the Republican conference seem fixated on creating. We had a Rules Committee hearing. The distinguished gentlewoman joined me just a few days ago, where one of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle was unabashed, who said, let's shut it down. And of course, for those Americans watching, they know that we've been here before. They've seen this movie. They have seen how it ends.
Yielding another for 30 seconds.
I think the gentlewoman.
Gentleman from Colorado has yielded 30 seconds.
They know, Mr. Speaker, that if Republicans are in control of the House, there is one thing they can count on, and that is that Republicans will shut the government down, as they did in mid-1990s under Speaker Newt Gingrich, as they did in 2013 under Speaker Boehner, as they did in 2018 under Speaker Ryan. I implore my colleagues to get back to the basics of governing. Work with us in good faith. Honor the agreement that you all voted for 4 months ago. Let's fund the government, Mr. Speaker, and with that, I yield back.
I recognize my very good friend from Colorado, Mr. Neguse, for any questions he may have for the panel.
Well, I thank the chairman and thank the witnesses, the chairman and the ranking members, for joining us today on such short notice. I do think context as to why the Rules Committee is meeting this afternoon is important. For those poor souls who may be watching this hearing on C-SPAN and assuming that the House is in fact in session, it's important to disabuse them of that notion. The House is not in session today. Why is the House not in session? Because the Speaker sent everyone home for the weekend. 7 days before the government is slated to shut down. I'll seek unanimous consent a little bit later in my remarks to enter into the record an article from Politico this morning. I was reading the headline, "More House rule votes have failed this week than in the past 2 decades." Just think about that. More House rules have failed in the last 5 days than in the last 20 years in the House of Representatives. That is House Republican control. Dysfunction. Now, most Americans might wonder, how did we get here? And I suppose, what legislative strategy has the House Republican caucus devised or developed to avoid a government shutdown? Apparently, that strategy is waste an entire summer debating bills on protecting gas stoves and the like, wait 8 days before government funding runs out, and then bring before this committee and the full House a series of partisan bills that stand no chance of passing in the Senate, much less being signed into law by the president. That's why we're here. And yeah, I think I heard someone, one of your colleagues, Republican colleague, I don't know if the microphone caught it, I believe he said he's not that wrong about it, right? Is that what you said? Mr. Ogles will have a chance to testify. Maybe perhaps he can confirm whether or not my summation of the events of the past 4 months is accurate. I suspect some of my Republican colleagues will be intellectually candid and honest about it in saying that that's true, that my description of the last 3 months under Republican control is accurate. It's unfortunate because there are Border Patrol agents and members of our armed forces, federal government employees across our country who are wondering whether or not they will get a paycheck in 8 days, whether or not the Republican caucus will get their act together so that the government can remain open and running. And so, I have great respect for my colleagues who are testifying today, and I hope they understand that as I ask a series of questions, because I do think the American people deserve answers as to why the Republican caucus has decided to engineer a government shutdown. And so, Mr. Joyce, Chairman Joyce, and I know you to be a reasonable member, and certainly by reputation, and you have a great working relationship, I understand, with my colleague from Texas, Mr. Cuellar, your ranking member on your subcommittee. Well, let me take a step back. I take it you would describe the situation on our southern border as urgent?
Yes.
Yeah. And I don't think you'd be alone in that view. When did the Homeland Security Subcommittee hold hearings on this bill that we're considering today? My understanding is you held a lot of hearings.
Right, and I believe we passed it in the full committee in July.
You passed it, would June 21st of this year sound about right? That the full committee marked up your bill?
I'll defer to you, sir, if
Yeah.
you have the date there. I know that I've been working on it since the day I was appointed as chairman with my dear friend Henry Cuellar to try to find better ways to make implement a strategy to contain what's happening at the border, because it's a national shame.
And I, for one, want to say I appreciate your commitment. The question I have is, why has it taken 100 days for the Homeland Security Subcommittee and the full Appropriations Committee to bring this bill to the Rules Committee, if the situation on the southern border is as urgent as you and I both believe it is?
Well, I certainly agree that if I was, running this place, I prioritize things perhaps in a different way, but
Aren't you running the place? Who is in charge?
Well,
do I talk to the Republican whip? Do I talk to Speaker McCarthy? Who do I ask this question of?
Well, the appropriations process normally takes place we have our field hearings throughout the first 6 months of the year.
Sure.
July, generally, as we have processed 10 of our 12 bills. The other 2 should get done shortly.
You did your work. June 21st, you marked up the bill. June 21st was 100 days ago.
Correct.
That's all I'm trying to ask is, what happened in this intervening 100 days? Why didn't we take up this bill last month or maybe in July? I don't understand.
I've been ready to go on June 22nd, sir, but I don't dictate the schedule.
Do you understand why the American people would be frustrated as they see a Republican caucus that purports and states that the situation on our southern border is urgent, but waits 100 days to bring a Homeland Security funding bill to the House floor? Would that makes sense
May
to
I
you?
respond, sir?
Yeah, of course, yes, sir.
Yeah, no, because I think the American people are completely frustrated because, you know, if you look at it, I remember, I think it was my dear friend Mario Diaz-Balart, who had presidents of the countries he's talked about before, who came here in 14 and 15, who said, we want our children. We want them to stay home. We wish the president at that time, President Obama, would say, you're not welcome here. And when he did that, when he started deporting people and pushing back on the entry, guess what? The numbers went down, and they stayed down. But this administration, from day one, has said there's a green light here. Please come. Now talking about giving Venezuelans cards and wish they can work in this country and stay in this country, and they don't care whether or not these people are coming across the border. You can't call what's happening down there Christian. You cannot call it humane. The journey
and I
these
can
people
tell-
are taking to come to freedom is not fair to anyone, and the American people are having to pay for it.
And
in
I
cities
can
all
tell your
throughout this
passion.
country.
And again, as I said, Mr. Joyce, Mr. Chairman, I understand your passion, I understand your commitment, and I understand that your subcommittee did its job working with Mr. Cuellar, holding a series of hearings earlier this year, and the Appropriations Committee. I have substantive disagreements, which we'll go through with respect to this particular bill, but the committee marked up the bill. And my point that I'm simply trying to better understand, I suppose, or the question that I am trying to reconcile in my mind is why the House Republican majority decided to spend the summer on bills regarding gas stoves and the lesser prairie chicken and then send everyone home for a 47-day recess only to come back and 7 days before the government is slated to shut down and troops and Border Patrol agents are slated to not receive paychecks, decide that now they'd like to bring this bill to the floor. That is my point, your answer in the very beginning was a candid one, that, I should talk to who's running the place, and that clearly is the Speaker and the Republican leadership. So I suppose, I don't know that they testify in front of this committee, so maybe I'll be waiting, and the American people will be waiting on an answer. You said, Mr. Joyce, in a recent interview, September 11th this year, in Forbes magazine, I think I got the quote right, you said, if we get close to September 30th, but we're making good headway on these things, a short continuing resolution, and that was in brackets, and the reporters, presuming that's what you're referring to, may be in line. And I suspect I'm not asking you to verify the veracity of that quote. I talked to a lot of reporters, but what I am curious as to whether or not you still hold that view. And perhaps maybe a finer point on it. How close is close enough to September 30th? Is 8 days close enough? Is 7 days close enough? Is 5 days close? At what point will the House Republican caucus say, you know what, we're close enough to the government shutting down and costing billions of dollars to the American economy, maybe doing a short-term CR on a bipartisan basis isn't a bad idea? Because it seems like you might be there with me on that front. And what I'm looking for, and I think what a lot of my colleagues on this side of the aisle are looking for, are governing partners, are just people who might have completely different ideological views, but are not interested in seeing this place, as the Speaker, I think, said in response to a question 2 days ago, burned down. I mean, that's what I'm asking.
I understand and appreciate your question, sir. I made that statement because I do believe that negotiations back and forth with between our members, 435 of us, members of this House, taking place that is moving the ball forward, in other words, addressing these concerns on bills like this to get our spending priorities in order, is something that deserves the time it takes to get that done. If we are approaching, like today, we have some bills are coming up. Next week, we'll have some more bills coming before this committee and hopefully getting to the floor. If there's a short period of time, but we're making striving to get our work done, I think a CR is in order to get to the next set of bills so we can put together, for once and for all, for the American people, 12 appropriation bills set at a finite number in which we can all administer this government and carry out the duties of this government in a way that functions. We haven't done that in a long time. And pass them in the House, pass them in the Senate, have the president sign it. And I've always been a big fan of that. I think, and you might even, if you checked in that same article, might say that I've said that people here should get an Approps 101 when they get here. I had the luxury of having something like Chairman Cole, at that time, being able to take me by the arm, if you will, and guide me through this process. And it's important. It's a long, involved process to come up with these bills that takes a hell of a lot of time and work. And the American people deserve to know that we're getting that work done. So if it takes a short-term CR to get to that end result, God bless.
I hear you, and I guess the question that I suppose many Americans are asking, and certainly I am, is why risk it? Why risk Border Patrol agents and our armed forces not getting paid? Why not do the CR? We're 7 days away. I mean, the sentiment I glean from your answer to that reporter, again, is a reasonable sentiment. The notion that, hey, listen, we get close to that September 30th date, it's not in the best interest of the country to allow the government to shut down. So let's do a CR as we've done in the past, and then get back to regular order. And I don't understand why, when that, I believe, is actually the view shared by certainly a majority of members of the House of Representatives, not a majority, I suppose, of the caucus, but perhaps yourself and perhaps others, why we can't proceed on that basis. But I appreciate your candor, and let me yield a moment to the ranking member, of course, of the full committee, Ms. DeLauro.
Thank you very, very much. Mr. Chairman, if I might excuse myself, I have a train to catch very shortly, but if I can, I had the real exceptional opportunity for the last 2 years in chairing the committee of making sure that with both Democrats and Republicans, as you well know, and some of my colleagues know, that we came together last December, and it was in the hands of the appropriators on both sides of the aisle that we hammered out the bills, and we compromised. No one got everything that they wanted, and we were able to, we passed a CR in December, and we need to do a CR for several weeks. As my colleagues all know on appropriations, it takes us a length of time to put the bills together, and then we can hammer out what the differences are. That is all. I'm ready to sit down anytime, any place, anywhere, to be able to begin this process. It is because what is contained in the 12 appropriations bills is every service, every resource that the American people, whether it is a lie heap, whether it is education, whether it is transportation, where it is national security, resides. We are the only place in which all of this resides. So if we can sit down and begin to hammer out the compromise where we need to go forward, that's where we need to go. And I just say, I'm happy at any time. I have to leave, but answer any questions as to any of this, Mr.
Before
Chairman.
the gentlelady leaves, and we understand you have a pressing engagement, does anybody have any questions for the gentlelady? No. If not, number one, thank you for making the effort to be here, and the gentlelady's excused.
Thank you so much.
And I have a few more questions for...
You still have the time.
I appreciate the chairman. And again...
I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Of course, and I thank the ranking member, again, for her service, and wish her safe travels. I do have a couple of substantive questions on both of the bills. First, Chairman Diaz-Balart, I want to ask a couple of questions about the State Ops Appropriations Bill. You made a comment in your opening, which I agree with, about the need for the United States to, I don't want to misquote you, but essentially getting serious about countering China. And what I am curious about, there are a number of decisions that the Appropriations Committee and your subcommittee have made with respect to how you are prioritizing a variety of different programs within the State Department and operated by the State Department that I respectfully disagree with. Just by way of example, do you know who is the continent of Africa's largest trading partner today?
It's probably very safe to say that it's China.
Yeah. It's China.
Yep.
Right. This budget cuts the U.S. African Development Foundation $30 million, $15 million below 2023. And I guess what I'm wondering is how you make the case that that entity, which obviously serves a critical role in fostering that trade relationship, your broader point, which I assume you agree with, is that we don't want to cede the international stage
to China. And so, given that they are the largest trading partner with the continent of Africa, how do you bridge that gap there?
If I may?
Of course.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for, I think, a very important question. And so, and you're right, it's a dangerous world. And I think it's a much more dangerous world, particularly after the fiasco in Afghanistan. So it is a dangerous world. And so, as I mentioned, and you're right, in my opening statement, we have made some tactical decisions. Cutting funding for either agencies that we found to not be very efficient or very effective, and then prioritize focused on specifically the issues that I mentioned, including confronting China. We designate $3.4 billion diplomatic engagement and foreign assistance programs and activities in support of the global Indo-Pacific strategy, again, countering China. We provide an additional, as I mentioned, $1 billion to advance the United States national security interests in the Indo-Pacific. Again, $1 billion more than President Biden did. So I think it is a very good conversation, discussion to figure out, what can we do even more. But I will tell you, if you're concerned about what we're doing in this bill, which is a lot stronger, with a lot less overall money than the president, then that's a conversation that we should also probably have with him. This bill does a lot more to counter China than the president could do while he is trying to spend a lot more money. And if you would allow me, sir, one of the things, and I mentioned it not to be a jerk, but one of the things that caught me off guard is in the press release, this is not by some individual member out there, this is the leadership of the Appropriation Committee, the Democratic leadership, actually criticizes my bill for cutting funds, including that go directly either to the Communist Party of China, et cetera, which we are doing. And so, yeah, we are re-emphasizing,
I'm just asking
reshifting.
about Africa. I don't know what.
But everywhere, including, we are actually shifting, taking money out of things that are not as effective, not as strong, to particularly do exactly what you were saying, which is emphasizing, attacking, not attacking, confronting, I should say. Thank you.
And I understand the argument. And by the way, I think, there's a broader debate, right? I think some of our colleagues might take the view or the position that none of these investments are necessary, right? And that perhaps the efficacy of those programs, or just more broadly, ideologically, believe that that's not something that the United States should be pursuing. I don't think that's your argument, is my sense. Let me frame it a different way. South America's largest trading partner
as well
is China, right? That concerns you, right? I assume?
Yes, sir.
Right? And you don't believe that's in the best interest of the United States.
Correct.
Right? And so the point I'm trying to make, this budget that you've submitted, it cuts, just another example, the Inter-American Foundation $24.5 million below 2023 levels, right? That foundation, obviously, again, similar to the Africa Development Commission that I mentioned, designed to foster trade relations. So if you are concerned, as I am, about countering China, and you are concerned, as I am, about China becoming the largest trading partner for South America, explain to me the reasoning behind cutting the very program that is designed to mitigate against that.
Yeah. And again, I thank you for your question and for your interest. I think we all know that there's a lot of duplication of effort, and there's a lot of wasted money, unfortunately. So what we have done is precisely focus on those things that we can show are the most effective. And yes, we are shaving in some cases, and in some cases, basically defunding in areas that frankly cannot show results, which is what I mentioned, for example. It's hard to believe. And I have to admit, I was shocked when we saw that there was money going to, for example, to pay back loans in some of these lending institutions that get U.S. taxpayer money, that go abroad. Then some of these countries were using those funds to pay back loans that they owed China. That is the kind of thing that, and by the way, I look forward to continuing working with you, because I think we're on the same page as far, again, if I may be so bold, I think we both agree that China is a serious threat, right? So I think we're on the same page there. The question is, I think you would also agree that assuming that every dollar in every institution that we're funding is necessarily effective, it is not. What we have done with a scalpel is look at where areas that, frankly, that are not being that effective, areas that are duplicative, areas that are wasteful, precisely to then confront China. And I think it is very clear that with a lot less money, we're doing a lot more to confront China, and I would argue in a lot of other areas. But I'm grateful for your interest in an area which I think is, frankly, a primary area of national security.
I appreciate the colloquy, and I certainly support a number of the investments that you identified within the broader bill in terms of the Indo-Pacific strategy in particular. And I guess I'll close with this with respect to your particular bill, and I have one more question for Mr. Joyce. The broader concern I think I have is if, as I said, we're all committed to this goal of countering China, in my mind, cutting the budgets of these various programs that are designed to ensure that China does not continue to serve as the largest trading partner in Latin America, or that China does not continue to serve as the largest trading partner for the continent of Africa. Embassies, right? I mean, you know this, of course, as the chairman. China has far more embassies than we do. They have most embassies of any country on the planet. I don't really understand the national security imperative in terms of, given that desire to counter China, of cutting the embassy investments here within this budget. And so that's the piece of this that I'm trying to reconcile. But I understand your argument. And I wouldn't disagree, by the way, perhaps we can have a conversation offline with various efforts that you might take to reform the programs to the extent that programs aren't working as well as they should, rather than zeroing them out entirely. So that, anyway, I'll leave it there. Mr. Joyce, the only question I have with respect to the underlying budget, and perhaps Mr. Cuellar, you can expound on a bit of this as well. I want to make sure I'm understanding this right. So from what I gleaned from the text, the budget bill cuts by $232 million requested funding to combat terrorism and cybersecurity. And my understanding is that Mr. Cuellar introduced an amendment during the full committee markup to essentially reverse that cut. Is that right? And if so, can you help us understand the reasoning behind that amendment failing?
Thank you. The reason we're cutting in different areas, and as a whole, I believe we've cut about $3 billion in spending, similar to Chairman Diaz-Balart, focused on those programs that actually work and concentrated our money there. So we're moving it around in different ways to make it work. And I understand and appreciate where my dear friend, the ranking member, was coming from. And I understand that there's important opportunities there to make sure that we secure our cyberspace, because it's something that we're getting attacked on a daily basis, not only by rogue nations, but by rogue international players. And it's something that we want to invest in a more comprehensive effort, but we also want to see results for the investments that we're making to keep our cyberspace secure.
Thank you. And Mr. Cuellar, if you care to... I think your amendment was to, as I understand it here, to mitigate the threat. It would have funded CBP, $691 million to mitigate against the threats of cybersecurity and terrorism, which was the request that CBP had made and which was not included in the mark. I hope I'm
and that is
capturing
correct.
that right.
Mr. Neguse, it was not included, and I'm hoping that the committee will make my amendment in order, at least have that debate on the floor and see what happens. All I'm saying is taking money away from the border wall and put it into a more targeted area where we can look at cybersecurity, where we can put more money for technology at the ports of entry, because most of the time some folks think that most of the drugs that come into the U.S. actually, they think it comes in between ports, but 90 to 94% of the meth, cocaine, fentanyl will come through ports of entry. And that's what we need to do a lot more. I know we added more money there, but we need to do a lot more to target there. And I still say, extend the perimeter out. I know some of y'all feel that the wall is the best way, and you say that it's the experts, but I do want to remind you that if you look at the Border Patrol Union 10 years ago, they thought the wall was an ineffective waste of dollars itself. I've asked every Border Patrol chief from Obama to from Bush, Obama, Trump, including Trump's Border Patrol chief, and asked them, how much time does a wall buy you, a fence buy you? All of them have said, quote, from a few seconds to a few minutes, depending who wants to cross it. So again, I think there are more targeted ways of putting money at the ports of entry and the checkpoints, Border Patrol checkpoints. So that's where most of the drugs are coming. In fact, 86 to 87% of the people that are stopped with drugs are U.S. citizens, not the migrants, and they're stopped at the Border Patrol checkpoints at the ports of entry. So we all want to secure the border. We just want to find the more efficient, effective way to doing that. Thank you, Mr. Neguse.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, and as evidenced by your answer, I misspoke with respect to cyber drug interdiction is what I was meant to reference. So in any event, with that, again, I would say thank you to the witnesses, recognizing that you came here on very short notice and understanding the unique circumstances of this particular hearing, and I'll yield back to the chairman.
Thank the chairman and the ranking member for holding this hearing. Thank you, Attorney General, for your testimony, for appearing before us, and for your service to our country. I have great respect for my colleague from Virginia on the other side of the aisle. I'm a bit confused as to why they have zeroed in or focused in on this particular letter in such a myopic way, but your testimony, and I wrote down words here, that the moment he, meaning the Trump-appointed U.S. attorney, Mr. Weiss, asked for the authority, I gave it to him. Seems pretty straightforward. And as you said, the letters that Mr. Weiss has written to this committee are publicly available, and we encourage anybody who's watching these hearings to certainly review those. As you said, clearly they're consistent with each other in terms of reading those letters collectively. I think it's important, Mr. Attorney General, to perhaps talk a bit about your record and your background in light of the various attacks, unfortunately, by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. My understanding is that you served as a special assistant to the Attorney General of the United States early on in your career. Is that right?
As my first job out of being a law clerk, yes.
Your first job out of law school. You later
being
were,
out of, after law clerking.
After law clerking, of course. You later were in private practice.
Yes.
And you left private practice to become a line attorney at the Department of Justice.
That's right, to be an assistant U.S. attorney.
An assistant U.S. attorney, a federal prosecutor, taking on organized crime cases, drug trafficking cases, violent crimes.
Yes, I don't know about the organized crime, organized drug trafficking, yes.
Following that service, you served in the Department of Justice as the principal associate
Attorney General. Deputy Attorney General, yes.
Deputy Attorney General. This is in the mid-90s.
That's right.
And in that capacity, you supervised a range of high-profile cases. Is that right?
Yes, they were high-profile cases.
The Unabomber case?
The what?
The Unabomber case.
The Unabomber case, yes.
The Atlanta Olympic bombing.
The Olympic bombing, yes.
The Oklahoma City bombing case.
Yes, that's right.
You received praise with respect to that latter investigation from the then Republican governor of the state of Oklahoma. Is that right?
Yes, who was a very good partner in the investigation with respect to Oklahoma.
You then were nominated and appointed to the federal bench, the U.S. District Court of Appeals here in Washington, D.C., correct?
For the U.S. Court of Appeals, yes.
Right. You were confirmed by a bipartisan majority. Over 20 Republican senators voted for your confirmation.
I'll take your word for it. I think that's correct.
You served on the bench for a significant period of time, ultimately becoming the chief judge.
Yes, that's right.
You left that position to return to the Department of Justice, where you had started your career.
Yes.
And you were confirmed into this position in which you now hold on a bipartisan basis in the Senate.
Yes.
I think it's unfortunate, Mr. Attorney General, that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have conflated questions about various cases that the department has brought with impugning your integrity. And I can assure you that the vast majority of the American people don't share their opinion, and that my constituents, the folks back in Colorado, are grateful for your lifetime of service that you have given to this country. And I recognize that this is I suspect, a frustrating exercise in terms of this particular hearing, because I suspect that you'd like to be talking about the prevalence of fentanyl in our communities and the work that the Department of Justice is doing to interdict it, the gun violence epidemic in our country, and the work that the FBI and other law enforcement agencies are doing to stop it. And my hope is that the next oversight hearing, perhaps those can be the focus, the bulk of the hearing. I'd be remiss if I didn't say one note about a rule that the Department of Justice recently promulgated. As you may recall, in 2021, March of 2021, I sent a letter to the Department of Justice requesting that the Department of Justice issue a rule regulating stabilizing braces. One of these braces was used, as you might recall, at a mass shooting in my community in Boulder, Colorado, where 10 Coloradans tragically lost their lives, including one police officer. And the Department of Justice issued a final rule earlier this year on this precise topic. Unfortunately, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have made it their mission to overturn this rule. I wonder if you might be able to just elaborate a bit on how the rule was drafted and deliberated within the department.
Yes, well, that horrific event in Boulder was one of several examples of the use of attachment of a semi-automatic pistol to a stabilizing brace intended to permit its firing from the shoulder. That violates the rule, the congressional statute against short-barreled rifles being possessed without registration, anything under 16 inches. The reason for Congress's statute, which I think probably goes back to the Al Capone era, was the power of such a weapon and the ability to aim such a weapon when it's shouldered. All that was done in this rule was to make clear that if you convert a pistol into a rifle designed to be fired from the shoulder, you're subject to the registration requirement.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. I yield back.
Attorney, with that headline would come away with the impression that it's dangerous if they said it almost killed me. But anyway, I'll move on to the broader conversation that Mr. McGovern was having. Previously, I certainly share his sentiments. He took most of the questions I was going to ask of Mr. Gates. To the extent that, Mr. Gates, you'd like to expound upon well, let me say it this way. Earlier, I don't know if you were here, Mr. Massey and I had an exchange, and he had a thoughtful retort to my use of the word engineered, that the Republican conference had engineered a shutdown, and as a very competent engineer himself, he took issue with that description. But you've been very clear that these failures lay at the feet of the Republican leadership in the House, and it seems to me as though the Speaker and the Republican leadership clearly wanted a shutdown, because I think if the American people
No, I think they wanted a CR.
If the American people looked at the facts and said, looked at the situation, the contextual situation, and said, okay, you've got a Republican leadership that refuses to bring a single, well, I guess about one, but the vast majority of these single subject spending bills to the floor. You've got a Republican leadership that refuses to bring a CR to the floor. In what world is that not a situation designed for maximal chaos and dysfunction?
No, they wanted to bring a CR. I think our leadership wanted to revert to the ineffective muscle memory that we'd all like to be liberated from. I think they wanted to have a short-term CR, and then a long-term CR, and then an omnibus. And I think that's what they want to do, because these very people have fought for that path during the 7 years I've been here in Congress, in one form or another, and in one party or another, no matter which party's occupied the Speaker's office. They didn't have the votes for the CR, is the reason that we're choosing this path instead. So I think it's a better path. It seems consistent with our broader goals. And you're right that there have been failures in our leadership, and it will, when we get through these bills, which are obviously our priority now, given the truncated time period that the ranking member noted, we're going to have to make some choices about our leadership. We're going to have to deal with their failures. And there seems to be universal agreement here that there's no logical explanation for not having done the work that the Congress used to do back in the 90s, other than the desire to centralize power with a few people, have a backroom deal, and then everybody else has to vote up or down on funding the whole government, which we can be liberated from. I want to give you hope that in state legislatures all over this country, there are individual single subject spending bills that move forward, and sometimes they pass, sometimes they fail, sometimes they've got to be brought up again. Oftentimes, Republicans and Democrats have to compromise, have to take half a loaf, and at the end of the day, their budgets balance, and they don't end up trillions of dollars in debt. So I favor the model that we've seen work around the country, and indeed, we may need new and better leadership in order to be compliant with the calendar going forward.
So I want to talk a bit about the timeline, I guess. And it, again, goes back to the point that Ranking McGovern referenced. Republican leadership has recessed the House for the weekend, so no one's here. I mean, we're here, of course, but we're not taking up any of these bills. The earliest any of these bills will be taken up will be, today's Friday, earliest will be next Wednesday. So you presuppose, and really it's actually going to be a question for Mr. Rosendale, because I think we're candid in your kind of articulation as to how you view shutdowns and the pain of a shutdown. The notion that these bills will all be passed, all 12, by the House, that the Senate, and of course there are deep disagreements, both with the Senate Democratic Caucus and the Senate Republicans as well, in terms of the bills that Republicans have authored in the House, the notion that the Senate will then accept those, or that they'll be able to be reconciled, right? And then the president signs those into law, all by a week from tomorrow, is clearly not realistic, right? And I think you'd agree with me on that front. I don't know, right? Okay, so operating on that same set of facts. So then, clearly that means the government's going to shut down. And the part I don't understand is, why not, maybe actually I'll come back to you in a minute, Mr. Rosendale, Mr. Biggs, why not do a short-term CR that enables you to have the debate that we are having right now for an interim period of time?
Define short-term. You can't. You can't define short-term because no one knows what that looks like. Because we've done short-termers in the past. Last year, how many did we do before we got the Omni? We did at least 2 CRs before we got the Omni, and I think you came in when I did. Maybe,
I did. Yeah.
So that's all we've ever really seen.
So let me pose the question to you then. How long are you willing to go?
I'm going to tell you that back to what I was explaining before. When there's an exit point from a suboptimal path, why do people not take it? This is a chance to actually exit the suboptimal path that we've been on. And we get the choice. We get the choice. The whole body gets to choose. We get to say, doggone it, we're going to keep going on this path. And we know that it's going to actually inure to do it again next year and the year following. And so when you say, well, why don't we do it for a week? Well, because you wouldn't say that we could get everything done in 2 weeks, would you?
Well, I guess here's the question. What do you tell the Border Patrol officer in the Yuma sector when he says, I'm not getting paid next week and I still have to work? You tell him, well, it's this political theory of optimalization as to whether political leaders make the right choice, and so therefore we've got to have short-term pain. Do you tell him, as Mr. Rosendale said, that it's a ruse and none of this is real? I don't understand. A week from now, people are going to stop getting paid.
So what do I tell the Border Patrol guys who say to me, Andy, this administration has emasculated everything we can do. What will you do? And I get the privilege of saying, well, we can either continue that on with a CR, where we keep the policies in place and the spending in place, and we get emasculated with 20,000 people crossing the border in about 5 days. And they say to me, I'm quitting anyway. I'm quitting anyway because I'm not getting, because you're not paying me overtime.
Sure.
And for 7 years, Biggs, you've been trying to get us overtime, and what's happened? Well, the Democrats have shut that down every time.
And I'm not disagreeing with you about the overtime. I guess what I'm saying is, why wouldn't you say to them that you're...
So are you...
I'm asking you,
Okay.
Why wouldn't you say, I'm working on it. I'm here in Washington on a Friday trying to get this done. We're negotiating, and I'm going to make sure you don't miss a paycheck as I work to change the policies that you believe that they disagree with. I don't understand why that is not on the table. That's all I'm asking.
Well, so here's my question for you. If we are, you're not going to get all 12 out by next week. Are you going to get DOD out? Are you going to get Homeland?
I'm asking you. You're in charge. I'm not. I have no idea if you're going to get these out. The Republicans run the House.
Then how can you say? Then how can you say you're not going to get them out? That's absurd to say. On one hand, you're not going to get them out, and then when I say, well, we're going to get these two out, and say, I have no idea. You have to be consistent, and I think the consistency would be.
Can you help me understand that part? I'm not understanding what.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, where you're inconsistent is to say, you're saying you cannot get these bills out.
I have no idea whether you can or not. I'm not.
Well, that's not what you
said.
said.
I'm saying that it seems unlikely that the Republicans are going to get out any spending bills since they've only gotten out one in the last 9 months. I have no idea. More rules went down last week than have gone down in the last 20 years. The Republicans control the House. You are in charge. As to whether or not the odds of you getting 12 spending bills out of the House and then also getting into an agreement with a Democratic-controlled Senate and a Democratic president, that seems unlikely. That's my point. And so why, given that uncertainty, why take the risk of Border Patrol agents or members of our armed forces or others going unpaid for any period of time?
Well, that's why we're moving the DOD and the DHS bill. I mean, we didn't pick these bills out of a hat, Mr. Neguse. We chose these bills because we're deeply concerned about those very things. And so probably what I'd tell that Border Patrol agent is to call their 2 Arizona senators and tell them to pick up our DHS bill. If they don't like what we've put together, pass a different version, and let's get to the business of negotiating it.
And and again, the point being, precisely, Mr. Gates, in that interim period, why not have a CR so that you can enable the negotiations? That's my point.
Maybe it's the lack of a CR that enables the negotiations better. Because what I've seen is the.
I hear you, and
and
I appreciate your honest answer, and I think that's the point, right? And that's the policy disagreement, or maybe not policy, but it's a strategic question and strategic disagreement that we clearly have, because I don't think that, in my view, and I understand folks have different opinions, I don't think that's an acceptable answer for the vast majority of people who will be impacted in a negative way by the government shutting down. And that's my view.
Can I clarify just something?
Sure, Ms. Marks.
If I just wanted to kind of point out, that I do think, you still guys can support border security and, and that commission and move forward. But even just to clear a record, actually, only non-essential services are affected, and essential services like border security and social security, mandatory, but people still getting checks and everything else. The challenge is going to be, it is.
I agree, but they'll be working without a paycheck.
The challenge is going to be when you have an opposite party administration, they will make it painful, right? They will shut down the parks and other things to make it painful. So it is definitely a risk that administration will decide to make it painful, right? Not necessarily, I understand that, right? Because it's not going to affect national security. All issues that affect national security and essential services still will be paid. Social security check and Medicare still will be paid. All mandatory spending will be paid regardless what it is, right? So non-essential services, but administration do this pay, right? So I am saying, okay, it's up to you guys. You try to figure out maybe we can make it work and get these authorizations, appropriations through, or maybe you can work with us and secure the border, and you support our Secure Border and Debt Commission. We can move it forward. And that's something you guys might need to do too, because we have some people, they have a very strong convictions, and I very respect these convictions too.
I appreciate your point, Mrs. Sparks, and the only thing I would say, just to clarify a technical matter, the essential workers does not mean that they necessarily get paid. They will get back pay. They are just simply not maybe. Yeah, someone point out that, because that's an open question. But the point is, you will have individuals, the individuals I mentioned, so Border Patrol officers, for example, that was what Mr. Cuellar was explaining. The Border Patrol officers in his district, if the government funding runs out a week from tomorrow, they will have to continue working without a paycheck. And so the notion that they'll be able to pay their
Paycheck
mortgages.
doesn't come on October
2
2nd,
weeks,
though.
correct.
Right,
You're
so,
right.
so when you,
October
but let's be
13th,
honest then
but-
about the calendar. Mr.
But
Neguse.
that's an important clarification. I just want to, for the record, to your point, Ms. Sparks, I understand your position more broadly, and so I'm not, I hear you.
Don't we think it's going to be a national security crisis, but I think it's going to be inconvenience in this. We'll still be fine with security, but I think we should do a better job. And maybe a good lesson for all of us, for both parties, we should go through normal processes in appropriations, how that it meant to be in this Congress.
Yeah, I, with respect to that last point about going through normal appropriations processes, couldn't agree more. And as you probably heard from my questioning of some of the witnesses previously, wish that Republicans would have started this much, much sooner so that we wouldn't be 7 days away from a shutdown. But Ms. Boebert, of course.
Thank you, Mr. Neguse. I mean, with all of this, of course, this administration is going to make a shutdown as painful as possible. We've already heard that the president is willing to fund Ukraine, but not certain parts of our federal government, will not pause funding for Ukraine. That's what's been reported in some areas. And I understand the tactics of my colleagues on the other side to really allow that pain to set in by pulling on the heartstrings of the American people and saying, oh, look at how awful they're being to you because they want process and they want you to hurt and they want you to feel this. Well, if you are concerned with the paychecks of our Border Patrol agents and alike, if you are truly concerned and you are putting that on us for a potential possible short-time shutdown, my question to you is, are you willing to vote in favor of our Homeland Security bill that does provide our Border Patrol agents with a paycheck? Are you willing to vote no to end their paycheck, or would you come on board and support that and help us get this funding in place to ensure that they're able to afford the things that they're hurting from the high inflation, by the reckless spending in Washington, D.C., by the lack of energy security and independence?
I've given you
Yes,
ample
sir.
time, so I
Yes,
want to
sir.
reclaim my time. So a couple of things I would say. First off, we have to dispense with this notion that a government shutdown isn't painful. I don't understand. We've sort of evolved here. Mr. Cole, the chairman, has made very clear on many, many occasions in this committee, he doesn't believe shutdowns are in the best interest of the country. They are painful. They cost the American economy. In 2019, the last time there was a shutdown, of course, as Mr. Biggs mentioned, we both came into the Congress at that time, it cost the American economy $11 billion. The notion that we're now debating the fine details as to whether or not members of our armed forces or Border Patrol officers are going to actually get paychecks, down the road, a month from now, 2 months from now, or what date the paycheck comes in, and so therefore they can find a way to make things work in the interim, is insanity. And the part that I suppose is most frustrating for me is to hear individuals say, we don't want to shut down. We don't want to shut down. But we've done nothing to fund government, and we're 8 days away from a shutdown, and we won't pass a stopgap measure to make sure that any of these consequences that I've identified are ameliorated. With respect to the specific question that my colleague from Colorado posed, the Senate has engaged in a bipartisan process to approve appropriation bills. The vast majority of their bills have come out of committee on a bipartisan basis. There's been an opportunity for Republican senators and Democratic senators to work together, come together, and pass a series of bills. That has not happened in the House. Each of these bills, unlike the past, and obviously we have a number of appropriators here who've served for many years, who, I'm sure have some thoughts and can opine on this as well. That has not been the process in the House. But regardless, the broader point remains. No one here believes it's realistic that the Senate and the House, if House Republicans are able to pass out these partisan spending bills before, notwithstanding sending everyone home for the weekend and not taking them up until next Wednesday, but if, I will in a moment, Mr. Biggs,
I always enjoy hearing from Mr. Biggs. But assuming that that is even the case, there's no argument that that is actually going to happen. And so what I have been trying to kind of glean from my colleagues here, and I appreciate them being here on a Friday afternoon testifying in front of this committee, all I'm trying to glean is a sense as to whether or not they would be supportive of taking the steps necessary to ensure that as they are making their case, Mr. Biggs, you have a certain view as to how border policy should be executed and the budgetary priorities. That's reflected in this bill that you brought to the committee, I suspect, or maybe, I don't know if you're voting for it or not, but seems like it. And the Senate has a view, and the President has a view, and as those views get reconciled, let's just make sure that Border Patrol officers and members of our armed forces and so many others don't end up getting, bearing the brunt of the damage while politicians in Washington debate it. And so that was my point, but I think we've traversed that ground quite a bit. At the risk of giving Mr. Biggs an opportunity to give the last word, I'm happy to yield to you for a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Neguse. And I'm not trying to churn it up. I'm just trying to, I did think that the question that was asked was actually salient, because I think Mr. McGovern asked us all, put us on the spot, which is fine. I think that's fair. You've been put on the spot, and you didn't answer the question.
With respect to the question that you posed about the Homeland Security bill, I don't know if you heard earlier the questions that I posed to Mr. Joyce about the various disagreements.
I was here.
So the fact that, we can have a debate, and I suspect this is going to happen on the floor. Yeah. Well, I don't know if we're going to have it. I guess it presupposes that the rule is going to pass, which Republicans haven't had much success at in the last few weeks. But presupposing that that is the case, and we have an opportunity to debate the bill, I think you're going to find a very robust debate along the lines of the debate that Mr. Roy and Mr. Cuellar had, which I actually thought was very informative and helpful. And so, yeah, I have issues with this bill. The fact that it doesn't include the $691 million that Mr. Cuellar fought to try to get into the bill for drug interdiction in CBP, I think is a problem. There are a variety of other problems, particularly as it relates to FEMA disaster funding, which is a big issue in my district, which continues to recover from a series of devastating wildfires. So, yes, the point that I was making earlier is that unlike the Senate, we haven't had the opportunity for a bipartisan discussion and negotiation about this appropriation bill. It's essentially been take it or leave it. And so you can assume the answer that you're going to get from many of my colleagues on our side of the aisle, given the product. But that's a debate we'll have about the merits of the bill.
I look forward to that colloquy.
On the floor. As do I. I'm going to yield back because I know I appreciate the chairman's generosity and with respect to the time. Thank you.
I think gentlelady from Minnesota.
I thank the chairman, and I thank the gentleman from Texas for his remarks. First, I will say to the gentleman from Kentucky, I share your concern with respect to FISA and the 702 surveillance reauthorization. Obviously, we serve on judiciary together, and so I look forward to working with you on that. And I appreciate your intellectual consistency, because I don't know that I could agree with you more in terms of the way that you framed the question that's before us here, which really is not, we're not talking about the underlying substance of the issue at heart. Of course, I hear you, Mr. Roy, and I know your passion and the passion of your constituents in Texas and your passion for HR too. This is really about how the body functions. And, I'm not an appropriator. I serve with Mr. Roy and with Mr. Massey on the Judiciary Committee, so I have empathy for your circumstances with respect to the negotiations you've had with the appropriators about how do you make the case for inclusion of this policy language of statutory changes in this process, and you're told no by the authorizers, you're told no by the appropriators. I get it. But this really is a bridge too far, because empowering the clerk in this way, essentially saying, okay, we're now going to have rules that move through this committee where we take up bills and we pass them, but they're never sent to the Senate unless other bills are signed by the president into law. You will create a level of gridlock, I think, in the legislative process that will become untenable. And in this instance, it's around, of course, the implications for a government shutdown, because the bill you're blocking the Senate from even looking at or considering is the bill to fund the Department of Homeland Security. And so it clearly wouldn't be realistic, and I suspect, not to put words in his mouth, but that my colleague from Texas would would concede this as well, given his sense as to what might happen in the next 2 weeks. Clearly not realistic that the Senate will pass H.R. 2 in its entirety, will not change a word, as Mr. McGovern said, a comma, a period. The Democratic Senate is just going to take that bill, pass it, and that the president, who indicated he would veto that bill, is then going to sign it. And then at that point, the clerk downstairs will send the bill funding Homeland Security and FEMA and the other agencies within DHS to the Senate. That's just not plausible. And so I hear you in terms of what you're trying to achieve on the policy front. And I would just offer a word of caution, I guess, because as Mr. Massey said, it's not just that, to your point, that this is bad for your conference. Not great for our conference in the future either, right? Again, once a precedent is established in this committee and in the broader House, it ends up being leveraged and utilized the moment the majority comes in the next round. I've talked openly about my disagreements with respect to the way in which the motion to recommit was treated previously in prior Congresses. And obviously it has evolved into a tool that doesn't really even resemble what it used to be 10, 20, 30 years ago. I think this is going to become the new norm, where you're going to have rules passed by the majority, and in an effort to convince 1 or 2 or 3 members to vote for the rule, you're going to have not a contingency, a conditioned precedent. You're going to tell the Senate, we're going to pass this bill, but you don't even get to look at it. We're not going to send this to you. I think the American people would be surprised to learn that we're sort of empowering an unelected clerk of the House in this way to sit on a bill and not send it to the United States Senate. What's the point of passing it if we're not going to send it to the Senate? I thought that was,
With the gentleman,
of course, yeah, I yield to the gentleman.
I'll try to be brief, but I think you made a good point. My objection is not to the substance, and maybe I shouldn't have even talked about one provision of that bill. I was giving it as an example of something the Senate may want to legislate on. But you're 100% right that this is about the procedure and what's the best procedure for moving appropriations bills. This isn't about the crisis, which is real, that not just for Texas, but for the whole country. And I appreciate my colleague's passion and dedication to solving this problem, and I agree with him on that. It's just not about that. My objection, which I think is Mr. Neguse's objection, is on the process, not the policy. I yield back.
And I yield back.
Any further discussion? Hearing none, the question's on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No.
I support the ranking member's amendment, and in part, I support it because while I have great respect for the chairman, I disagree with his description of the views espoused by some of the members in his conference who have made it abundantly clear that this commission has one purpose alone, and that is to slash programs like Social Security and Medicare. And I don't think that they're particularly unabashed about it. Mr. Norman and I have had exchanges in the past, and I'm happy to give him an opportunity if he cares to clarify that. But you have not been shy in telegraphing your view about the cuts and reforms that you'd like to make to Social Security and Medicare, and that this commission is a vehicle to achieve that. Or is that not your view?
No, I never brought up Social Security, never brought up Medicaid, Medicare. What I have brought up is we've got to get this country back on a firm financial footing. My good friends on the other aisle don't cut anything. And you bring up, the specifics of programs that just mainly to inspire or excite what I guess you consider your base is. We don't.
Well, let me reclaim my time. I'm surprised that you would make the case that you've never proposed any changes to Social Security and Medicare. I've heard you say that in this committee. I don't have the statements in front of me, but if you want to walk back from those, you can.
No, I'm not walking back. There is a time we're going to have to get real with, rather than have Social Security go bankrupt in, 2035? Rather than have the mandatory, we have got to address at some point. None of these address any of that, nor would we cut that now. We've got our hands full with the 30% that needs to be cut. We got a bloated government now. So.
Yeah, well, again, I think
the American people understand that when a group of members on your side of the aisle, and I counted you among them, at least I suppose, again, maybe you changed your tune the last couple of days, but make very clear that they would like to cut these vital programs and create a vehicle through this so-called debt commission to achieve it. The fact that you might change your view today does nothing to change the underlying facts or the reality for the American people and what this commission would ultimately accomplish. Look, I'll just say more broadly, I support the ranking member's amendment, but I can remember a day 8, 9 months ago when I was told by my friends on the other side of the aisle that there was a new day in Washington, the days of backroom deals with leadership crafting large bills or CRs or what have you, and then bringing them to this committee in the dead of night, posting them. What time was this posted? I don't know, midnight, 1 o'clock last night, and then telling your members that they're all expected to vote the same day on the text of that bill. I thought those days were done. That's what I heard from my colleague from Kentucky and from Texas. Well, I don't understand. I spent days on the floor listening to theatrical speeches about the new norms in Washington, D.C., the fight against the establishment. Lo and behold, I wake up and the very people claiming that those days were done are now the people who are engaging in it. This is regular order? This is the regular order that you spoke of? These are the reforms you spoke of? CRs posted in the dead of night, telling 435 members, get ready, you're going to vote on it in a few hours? Man, I am surprised and disappointed, to say nothing, of course, of the substance of this bill, which Ranking Member McGovern articulated well. The House Republican Conference has been, as I said in prior meetings, engineering a government shutdown for weeks. And apparently, they're getting their wish, because this CR, in effect, is a shutdown of the government. I don't know what else you call defunding the FBI and the DEA. What do you call that? What do you call cuts that literally will mean there are less FBI agents, DEA agents, state and local officer cuts by virtue of the grant programs and partnerships that exist between the Department of Justice and our local law enforcement officers? What else do you call that? What else do you call a 57% cut to wildland firefighters suppression? What do you call that in the wake of Maui and devastating wildfires across the Rocky Mountain West in my state, in Colorado? We've got a bipartisan coalition where we've been trying to fight to increase wildland fire suppression. I guess I'm going to have to go find these colleagues that I was working with and ask them why they've decided to abandon that effort and vote for these draconian cuts. The final thing I will say, and I want to yield to my colleague from Pennsylvania, but I understand for some of my colleagues, this is purely ideological. They believe, I take Mr. Norman, with respect to his description of government and how he sees it, at his word. He has said he wants to slash spending, right? You've said that. That's not more as a broad principle, right? And that's what you intend to do in this bill. What surprises me are the members in your caucus, these so-called moderates, people who claim that they're here for the good of the order, they're going to work across party lines, that they don't want to see any of these terrible consequences happen, and then yet go straight to the floor and vote in favor of it. That's what surprises me. All these members for weeks on TV, members of your conference, calling your conference the clown show and all the rest. These are not my words. These are their words. And then what do? In an hour and a half, they'll march to the floor and vote for a rule that cuts funding for FBI agents and DEA agents and wildland fire suppression and God knows what else that you put in this CR that you published 8 hours ago. That's what they'll do. It's what we've grown and come accustomed to expect. But I can tell you the American people are watching, and they don't like what they're seeing. So with that, I'll yield to my colleague from Pennsylvania.
Thank you. Just with respect to this debt commission or whatever it's called, if it were actually to come into being, like every...
For any questions you may have. Oh, that's certainly fine. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for any questions he may have.
I thank the chairman, and I thank the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, and thank you to Chairman Womack and my friend from Maryland, former Majority Leader, and the ranking member. Appreciate both of you being here. I have a couple of questions for you, Chairman Womack, and I want to first echo, I think, the sentiments that were expressed by my colleague from New Mexico, because I certainly know you by reputation to be intellectually candid and honest and have great respect for you and your service in the House. But I do have some serious concerns about this particular bill that's been brought before the committee and that the House will soon consider. I assume you'd agree with me, I suspect the ranking member would too, that we're broadly speaking, given what's happening in the world, concerned about terrorism. Is that something that you think the American people should be concerned about?
We are, yes. I share that concern.
Are you familiar with the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence?
I am.
Does this bill cut funding for the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, or does it increase funding?
I mean, it's among the, as I mentioned a minute ago, the categories that got plussed up were few, okay? This was one of the categories that was cut.
So the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence is cut in this bill. It's cut by about $9.2 million. That sound about right?
I'll take your word for it, because I don't have, I'm not
of course,
looking at the...
no problem, and I'm not putting you on these numbers.
I got a lot of line
I can
items.
attest to you. It's
Sure.
what is reflected in what the committee has submitted to us. $37.2 million below the president's request, a $9.2 million cut for the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, which, if you know, of course, is designed to essentially develop and implement U.S. government strategies to combat terrorism.
But it's not the only. I mean...
Sure, it's not the only, but I don't know that it's a good
fair.
sign
Yeah.
that the Office of Terrorism would be cut by the Republican budget, given what's happening in the state of the world. In any event, I'll move on. You're familiar, I know, with FinCEN.
I am.
This is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, is that right?
Correct.
Is it cut or increased in this budget?
It's cut in this budget.
$24.2 million below the fiscal year 23 level, right? About right.
Again, I'm not looking at my line items. I don't have them all committed to
No
memory.
worries. Well, I can attest to you. That's the scale of the cut, which is $62.9 million below the president's request. And again, this is an agency designed to pursue financial crimes. It's a law enforcement agency, right?
That's fair.
The Office of National Drug Control Policy, is it cut in this budget or is it increased?
It is cut.
It's
in the
cut
budget.
$9.6 million. Again,
It is.
very concerned, as I know my colleagues are, about pervasiveness of fentanyl, across the country and the need to address that crisis. This budget cuts the National Drug Control Policy Office by $9.6 million. The SEC, everyone's familiar with the SEC. Does this budget cut or increase funding?
It cuts the SEC, yes.
By about $2 billion.
Cuts the SEC, yeah.
So
we stipulate to all of those assertions.
I appreciate that stipulation. And Mr. Womack, again, it's not meant to be pejorative. It's simply to say that what you call right-sizing the government seems to be cutting the Office of Terrorism, cutting the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, cutting the Office of National Drug Policy, cutting the Securities Exchange Commission. That does not sound like right-sizing the government to me. That sounds like defunding law enforcement. And that's certainly not something that I can support and that I suspect the vast majority, if not every one of my colleagues on our side of the aisle can support. And so I would hope that, once this process is done, because again, I know you to be a reasonable member, that we can get back to having a serious conversation about a budget that, yes, makes the necessary adjustments where appropriate in light of the fiscal condition of the country, but does not put at risk core law enforcement functions, which unfortunately this budget does. And that's all I have. I'm happy to give the ranking member an opportunity to the extent he'd like to opine on that, but absent that, I'll yield back.
The gentleman's right.
Simple enough for me. Thank you, and I thank the chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.